Jim, I'm going to give it back to you again for a moment.
Bob, I have some word in from other quarters. Here in New York, the Broadway theaters that were closed last night because of the president's death resumed production today with the usual matinee and evening performances. The National Association of Broadcasters today canceled its fall conference that was scheduled for Monday and Tuesday out in San Francisco because of the death of the president. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. And a dispatch is in from Havana. The Cuban press bannerlined today the news of President Kennedy's assassination, but none made any comment or carried statements of officials in Havana. Only the expression of sympathy made in the United Nations yesterday by Ambassador Carlos Lechuga was published, but the newspapers did publish long biographies of President Kennedy and his successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson. It's rather paradoxical, I think, that in Moscow, doubtless the most influential man in the Soviet Union in the past 3 years, next to Premier Khrushchev, was President Kennedy. It was bound to be that way, for with no nation, not even China, has the Soviet Union so many points of international contact as with the United States. Almost every move made by the Soviet Union had to be taken with one eye on the United States and the man who was at its helm. What the attitude will be toward President Lyndon Johnson is not now clearly outlined. Toward Mr. Kennedy, the change in attitude could be most sharply marked in the period between the summer of 1961, when the President and the Soviet Premier met in Vienna, and the Cuban affair. There's no doubt that Mr. Khrushchev set out to give the new president, then barely 6 months in office, a taste of international power politics at that Vienna meeting. Reports of the conference from people who were at the sessions, or at least nearby, were that it was a very stormy and frightening session indeed. And months later, Premier Khrushchev was reported to have said, "I gave that young man a good scare." But the young man returned the scare in October of 1962 when he moved deliberately to the brink of nuclear war, moved divisions of American troops and bombers to the Atlantic coast facing Cuba, and told the Soviet premier to get his rockets off the island. The premier did. Khrushchev then showed new respect for Mr. Kennedy. It reflected a respect for a man who'd learned the uses of power, but a man prepared to control that power, even in the heat of such an affair as the Cuban rockets. The public image of President Kennedy tended to be a relatively warm one in Moscow. Personalities influence but do not change policies, so Soviet policy toward the United States has not changed much. The communist aim is still to bring down the big capitalist state whose position is so resistant to red aims around the world. Neither the aim nor the tone of expressing it has changed greatly. Of course, in Moscow, President Johnson is largely unknown as a public figure. His position as vice president has always left him in the shadow, but doubtless the whole Soviet hierarchy has already begun a thorough study of what new changes in relationship and national attitudes will come as a result of the change in leaders. And we've still had no word of any reaction to the death of the president from communist China. Of course, earlier today, very early today, Premier Khrushchev, although he made no public comment on the death of the president, did send messages of condolence to the members of the Kennedy family, to Mrs. Kennedy, to Robert Kennedy, and to President Kennedy's mother and father, and he also sent an official letter of cable of sympathy to Lyndon Baines Johnson, the new president of the United States.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time.
Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join with President Johnson in urging Americans to assemble in their respective churches to pay homage of love and reverence to Mr. Kennedy's memory.
President Johnson's first public official act today was to proclaim Monday, November the 25th, the National Day of Mourning for a great and good man, the martyred John F. Kennedy. President Johnson urged Americans to assemble in churches to pay the homage of love and reverence to his slain former chief. He invited all the peoples of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication. The proclamation was issued in the course of what was probably the most crowded day in the life of this 55-year-old Texan who has been thrust into the White House by an assassin's bullet. We heard that official proclamation read about an hour ago by Sandra Van Oker directly from Washington. Since then, Mr. Johnson has conferred with his intelligence chief. He's scheduled his first meeting with the cabinet at 2:30 this afternoon. That's just a half hour from now. We know that he will ask the members of his cabinet not to submit their resignations, as is normally the case when there's a change of administration in the White House. And Mr. Johnson has joined with others in the silent tribute beside the casket of the dead president, and he's attended his services for him and his predecessor. In his proclamation, President Johnson ordered federal offices throughout the nation to close on Monday, the day of the slain president's funeral, a pontifical requiem mass to be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. Again, we have further news from overseas. Let's switch to Wlls-Hangen in Bonn.
The West German government expressed full confidence in President Johnson today, but on the Bonn marketplace, old women asked carefully, who is going to protect us now? A Bonn government spokesman told reporters, many of our leaders know Johnson personally. We have the fullest confidence that he will carry on President Kennedy's policies. Chancellor Ludwig Erhard has pledged West Germany will stand by America's side in good times as well as bad. He's called a special cabinet meeting tomorrow morning to pay homage to the late president. Lyndon Johnson is remembered here for 2 visits to Germany while he was vice president, especially a morale-boosting trip to West Berlin a few days after the communists put up the wall dividing the city in August 1961. The man who built the wall, East German Communist boss Walter Ulbricht, has cabled Mr. Johnson denouncing what he calls the infamous forces of terrorism that assassinated the late president. Wlls-Hangen, NBC News, Bonn.
That was a report from Wlls-Hangen in Bonn. This report, as all the others we've had from overseas, emphasizes the reaction to the death of the president. Closer at home, we have an immediate reaction in Chicago, the second largest city of the nation. Mayor is Richard J. Daley. Richard J. Daley, for many years, has been a close personal friend of President Kennedy's. He was instrumental in helping John F. Kennedy reach the White House. Yesterday, upon being informed of the president's death, he expressed great sorrow, profound shock over the tragic event. There were many official mourning services held in Chicago during the day at Holy Name Cathedral and other Roman Catholic and Protestant churches in the nation's second largest city. I've just been informed that we have important new developments now in Dallas, and for that story, let's switch to Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Dallas Police Headquarters is District Attorney Henry Wade, whose job it will be to prosecute Lee Oswald, the man accused of killing President Kennedy. He also is a longtime and close friend of Texas Governor John Connally, who was wounded, of course, in the bullet attack on Friday. Mr. District Attorney, do you feel that you now have enough evidence to successfully prosecute Oswald?
I think we have sufficient evidence at present to prove that he was the one that killed the president.
What is the most telling of that evidence?
Well, I don't want to go into all of the evidence here because we have to pick a jury that's going to try him, and I am refraining from going into any of the evidence that we have.
Suffice it to say that you now feel you have adequate evidence?
Yes, I feel we have sufficient evidence at present. Of course, we want more. The more we have, the better off we are. But if we had to go on just what we got, we have sufficient.
What legal steps now lie ahead before Oswald can be brought to trial?
Under Texas law, the defendant's charged in the justice court. Then the next proceedings is the grand jury. Everyone's tried in Texas on an indictment, which only a grand jury can return. defendant's entitled to an examining trial or a hearing, a writ of habeas corpus hearing on whether or not he can justly be held without bail. Texas law allows people the only people that can be denied bail under the Texas law is a person who will likely get the death penalty. And he can have a hearing, either examining trial or a hearing before a district judge on a writ of habeas corpus, see whether remanding him without bail was proper in this case.
And this, of course, is virtually unique in Texas as compared to other states, is it not? The procedures involved?
Well, I'm more familiar with the ones here than in other states. This is a state district court.
What is the earliest you think he could be brought to trial?
Well, it'll be presented to the grand jury either Wednesday of next week or Monday, December the 2nd, one of those 2 days. It'll be set for trial within about 2 weeks thereafter. The defendant is entitled usually to 1 or 2 continuances if he asks for them. I figure that he will likely be tried around the middle of January.
Do you think you can find an unbiased jury in Dallas, Texas?
We hope we can find a jury that'll be fair to the defendant and fair to us.
And will you ask death in the electric chair for Lee Oswald?
Yes, sir.
That was District Attorney Henry Wade, District Attorney of Dallas County. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
Thank you very much, Tom Pettit. While we've been reporting here, my colleague Russ Ward has been checking on new developments around the world, checking on the summary of events up to this time. Here is Russ Ward.
Thank you, Jim. Much of my checking has been in a coffee shop across the street getting a bite of lunch. I might add that at all the tables, people were talking about this tragedy. Groups of people discussing where they were, what they were doing when they first heard of the news. I might also mention that I tried to buy a newspaper at the coffee shop and was told they were sold out, that they had been for some time, at which point a waitress came over and said, "I happen to have a copy of a paper if you'd like to see it, but you have to promise to give it back to me." So she allowed me to read her newspaper, apologizing that it wasn't a New York Times, but let me read it anyhow, which I did, and returned the paper to her. I assume she passed it on to another customer who was unable to find the paper anywhere. Just an indication of the thirst for news that people have, both the written media and what they are receiving currently on our continuous coverage on radio and television. A sorrowing President Lyndon Johnson proclaiming Monday, November 25th, a national day of mourning for a great and good man, the martyr John F. Kennedy. President Johnson urging Americans to assemble in churches on that day to pay the homage of love and reverence to the slain former chief executive. Mr. Johnson inviting all the peoples of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication. The proclamation, issued a short time ago in the course of what was probably the most crowded day in the life of the 55-year-old newly sworn-in president who had been thrust into the White House by an assassin's bullet in Dallas, Texas. Mrs. Kennedy and her 2 children, who have been told of their father's death, have attended a private mass at the White House. 75 friends and relatives also were present. News Secretary Pierre Salinger says the children, Caroline and John Jr., were told last night. He did not say who told them. Former President Eisenhower, other dignitaries, close friends of the slain president, and members of his family have been filing past Kennedy's closed coffin in the White House today. The body to be moved to the Capitol building tomorrow, where it will lie in state. Then on Monday, it'll be transferred to St. Matthew's Cathedral for services at high noon. Among the dignitaries to attend the funeral services will be President de Gaulle of France, Prince Philip of Britain, King Baudouin of the Belgian. White House News Secretary Pierre Salinger says it is not yet determined where Mr. Kennedy will be buried. Further details on this are expected later in the day. The White House says a horse-drawn caisson preceded by police and military escorts, will carry the body from the Executive Mansion to the Capitol building tomorrow. It will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda until it is taken to St. Matthew's Cathedral, again on the escorted caisson. The escort of servicemen will be followed by a muffled drum company, and next in procession will be a company of Navy personnel, followed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff and a group of clergymen of all faiths. A single serviceman carrying the presidential flag will follow. Mrs. Kennedy, other members of the Kennedy family, and the new president and Mrs. Lyndon Johnson will follow in automobiles. Here in New York City, all public schools and offices will be closed on Monday. A Board of Education announcement in Manhattan says the public schools of New York City share the nation's great grief over the tragic death of President Kennedy. To make it possible for all pupils to be with their families for religious or other services on Monday, the schools and offices of the school system will be closed all day. Now for further details from the nation's capital on this tragedy, we switch to Robert McCormick in Washington.
Earlier today, I had the privilege, really, of talking to an old friend of mine here on radio, and we put what he had to say on tape. I don't know precisely in what condition the tape is at this moment in the confusion, but in case I do not say so, on this awfully interesting talk with him, I was interviewing Sidney Hyman, the political historian, the author of The American President and other books, three of which, by the way, the late President Kennedy asked especially be put in the White House library. If I now repeat myself, forgive me. I have here with me an old friend and a most interesting person, Sidney Hyman, the political historian, author, as you know, of The American President, one of the more fascinating books of recent years, and who, by the way, has three books that were put in the White House library by the late President and Mrs. Kennedy, Beckoning Frontiers, and then the book he did with Robert Sherwood, Roosevelt and Hopkins. And I'd like to ask him some questions that might seem a little abstruse at first, but which actually aren't. Sidney, what happens psychologically to a country after a president dies?
There's been a fairly definite pattern to this, as you can see when you look back at the history of the 7 preceding presidents who died in office. The first reaction is, of course, one of sympathy for the family of the president. The second reaction is a rallying of the national will to the vice president who does succeed to the presidency. Party divisions, angers, rancors are suddenly forgotten, and you have a sense of transcendent national unity. People rallying of all factions rallying around the vice president. But then something disturbing does set in after that, and I hope it won't set in this time. The very fact of the way in which we have chosen vice presidents in the past tends to produce, after the shock of the death of a president, tends to produce a certain psychological disarray in the country. People remember that maybe the vice president was chosen for party purposes in order to console a faction of the party that lost out. People who voted for the president but didn't want to vote for the vice president feel that somehow the man who is now president shouldn't be there. And even when he goes on to win the presidency in his own right, as several of them did, the country has in times past felt that the vice president who is now president is somehow an eccentric act of fate. He shouldn't be there, and what issues from him is not really lawful.
In a sense, they consider him a political freak.
They have, in fact, in times past thought that, yes.
Well, has the death in office of any president actually changed American history, American policies that would influence history?
I think so, and very specifically, and you can just run through some of the changes that have occurred. In the first case, when William Henry Harrison died in the 1840s and John Tyler succeeded to him to the presidency, it was Tyler's decision to annex Texas which led to the Mexican War. When Millard Fillmore succeeded President Zachary Taylor, it was Millard Fillmore who approved the Compromise of 1850, which eventually set the stage for the Civil War. When Andrew Johnson succeeded Abraham Lincoln, it was Johnson's inability to get along with the radical Republicans who were in control of the Congress, which set the stage for some of the unhappier aspects of the Reconstruction period in the South. On a more positive side, after Theodore Roosevelt succeeded William McKinley as president, Theodore Roosevelt really became the first of the modern presidents. He brought the presidency into a realm of national life that no preceding president had ever done, and he also brought America into world affairs as no one had ever done. And there can be no question but that the succession of Harry Truman after the death of Franklin Roosevelt could very well have changed the course of history.
Generally, how have our vice presidents measured up as presidents?
This is one of the most remarkable things about the office of the presidency. It's the way the office itself somehow transfigures the man who becomes president, no matter what he has been before. Many of the vice presidents had seemed, on assuming the presidency, to be rather mediocre figures, and yet several of them, at least, certainly Theodore Roosevelt, exceeded in capacity the man who had held the presidency just before them. Even one of the weaker of the vice presidents who succeeded to the presidency, John Tyler, really defended the presidency as an institution at a time when it was coming under bitter attack by the Congress, when some senators, very powerful senators led by Henry Clay, wanted to reduce the presidency almost to a cipher. Tyler successfully defended the presidency as a separate and coordinate branch of the government. I think that even Calvin Coolidge, who succeeded Harding as president, I think was a distinct improvement on Harding. These are part of the mysteries and part of the glory and part of the terror of the presidency itself, what it does to men who get into that office.
That's extremely well put. Of course, we have noticed that here. We've watched vice presidents grow. We have watched presidents grow and mature in their jobs, and it really is amazing what happens to them. The depth of insight they get after just a few months and the degree of judicious perspective they get is most amazing to us. I'd never been able to put it as well as you.
Well, this is, when you pick a president, you really don't know what you're getting until the materials of the place are turned over to him, and the same thing goes for the vice presidency. Harry Truman used to say that there is no future in the presidency. What he meant really was that after a man is president, elected to the presidency, what other higher goal can he aspire for? And that the only motive a man has in being, after he is elected president, is to really, with all the depths of his being, honor the oath he takes as president to uphold, defend, and protect the Constitution to the best of his abilities. And there is this passionate commitment to that. We can have in times past, we can criticize our presidents for being foolish or wise, rash or judicious, and yet we've never had anything in the presidency like the leaders of Europe, the angry men, the destructive men. Our presidents, whether wise or foolish, competent or incompetent, have been, in human terms, good men.
But thank you very much, Sidney. You have been listening to Sidney Hyman, the political historian, with some observations about the presidency and what happens to vice presidents who find themselves suddenly thrust into the midst of responsibilities that are simply incomprehensible to the lay citizen in this country. President Truman, former President Truman, was a perfect example of a vice president maturing and growing in his job when he became president. I just happened to have taken the first trip with President Truman after he became president, And since Mr. Truman himself has said this, I don't feel that I should be restrained about it. He had so little concept of the enormous burdens and responsibilities of his new job, he thought he could continue to behave in the fashion of a friendly and somewhat garrulous senator, and that he could sort of wave off what he said as being just the declarations of another senator rather than the declarations of a head of state. He, as a matter of fact, at Reelfoot Lake in Tennessee, invited us over one evening for a quiet little sociable with him, as he said no business would be done. And as we began talking to him, he very casually said that we would not share our atomic secrets with any foreign country. At that time, of course, that was a consuming question all over the world. And when we all began to bolt for the door and the nearest telephones, President Truman stood there looking very dazed and very unhappy and very displeased that we were running out on him, and had no concept at all of what his offhand declaration had meant. I don't mean to imply that he made the decision in an offhand fashion, because he hadn't. It was just that he didn't realize that that decision was of such extreme importance. But it didn't take President Truman very long to find out how important his decisions were, and he made some of the most momentous rulings that anyone in the White House has ever had to make, including the question, of course, of whether to drop the atomic bomb, and the aid to Greece and Turkey, which was the predecessor of all of our modern structure of foreign policy, and the beginning of the containment policy with the Russians and the communist bloc nations. It's worth remembering here as we go by that the president, of course, is dead, but the Kennedy family is far from out of politics. The Attorney General Robert is a man of prominence and a man who's had a tremendous impact on our political and social structure since he's been Attorney General. And another brother, Senator Edward Kennedy, has already made his mark in the Senate in a very quiet way. He has behaved as new senators are traditionally supposed to behave. He's kept relatively quiet and listened. He, of course, has always voted on the president's side, and he has made one or two speeches, both of which have been quite effective. And when he's declared himself, he's done it in a firm and solid way, even when it was done briefly and not through the medium of a full-fledged Senate speech. So two of the Kennedy brothers are still going. We undoubtedly will hear a lot more of them. There's another incidental note here that I would like to get in, and perhaps this has been used before, but I had not heard it, that the President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson, whose real name of Claudia is overwhelmed by her more commonly used name of Lady Bird, they spent 20 minutes with the late President Kennedy's widow, Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy, in the White House today. President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson squeezed this in. That's not a proper way to put it. They probably squeezed their official work in around that. But in any event, it came in the midst of a very, very busy day indeed. The president left his home, which is not far from the White House, at 8:45 this morning, Washington time, Eastern Standard Time. He had a very brief meeting with Attorney General Robert Kennedy, of whom we were talking a moment ago. He was briefed by Central Intelligence Agency Director John McCone. Then he talked to McGeorge Bundy, the special White House assistant on national security affairs. He found time to check with J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI about the investigation of the assassination of the president. Since then, he's met Republican and Democratic leaders of both the House and the Senate. He has, or is just about to meet with his cabinet. One of his tasks at that point will be to tell the cabinet to sit tight, not to submit, at least at this time, the resignations that are a formality when a new regime takes over in the White House. He also issued his first proclamation as president declaring Monday a day of mourning for the late President Kennedy. He issued his first executive order closing down all government agencies that possibly could be closed, closing them Monday as a token of respect to the late president. And, Jim, we have something else coming up down here before very long, but it's not quite ready. Do you have anything else to put in the meantime?
Robert, it might be appropriate to inform our listeners they are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. At the risk of seeming repetitious, we might mention again news you heard earlier from Dallas, that 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, accused murderer of President Kennedy, has gunpowder traces on both hands indicating that he recently used a rifle, a type of weapon that killed the chief executive. The prisoner, formerly accused of the assassination in the ambush yesterday, has refused to take a lie detector test. It was also disclosed from Dallas that Oswald once threatened former Secretary of Navy John B. Connally to, quote, employ all means to redress the wrong he felt was done him while he was in the Marine Corps. Connally, now governor of Texas, was gravely wounded yesterday when the president was killed. For further developments now on this story, we go to Ron Nesson at Washington National Airport.
Governors and other officials continue to pour into Washington, expressing their grief at the death of John Kennedy and their confidence in Lyndon Johnson as the new president. Governor Sanford of North Carolina, one of the earliest supporters of John Kennedy's presidential candidacy, said he is sure Lyndon Johnson has the capability of meeting the challenge he now faces. He says Lyndon Johnson has the capacity to be a very great president. Governor Hughes of New Jersey also says Lyndon Johnson will be a great president. Governor Saunders of Georgia says the people of his state, who sometimes didn't agree with Mr. Kennedy, mourn him greatly. Expected momentarily at the Washington airport is Harry S. Truman. This is Ron Nesson, NBC News, at the airport in Washington.
Chief Justice Earl Warren has announced that the Supreme Court has canceled the sitting scheduled for next Monday out of respect to the memory of the late president. An opinion day session had been planned to hand down rulings. Instead, the court will meet next on Monday, December 2nd. Under the previous schedule, the court would have been in recess from next Monday to December 9th. President Johnson has asked all chiefs of U.S. foreign missions to stay on the job and not submit the usual resignations. The State Department announced this today, increasing the belief the new president is eager to emphasize a continuation of the foreign policies of the late President Kennedy. The State Department press officer, Richard Phillips, dictated to newsmen today this following statement. While in the past it has been customary to request the formal resignation of chiefs of American diplomatic missions on the succession of office of a new president, the submission of formal letters of resignation is not requested or desired. The new president has asked that all chiefs of mission remain at their posts and continue to discharge their duties. President Johnson, as we mentioned earlier, has proclaimed Monday, November 25th, a national day of mourning for a great and good man, as he described the late President Kennedy. He urged Americans to assemble in churches to pay the homage of love and reverence to the slain former chief, and he invited all the peoples of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication.
The NBC Radio Network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy.
Our coverage will continue after station identification until 11 p.m. this evening, and again tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock, Monday morning at 7 o'clock. Much colder air continues to spread southeastward and eastward across the Ohio Valley and will result in a hard freeze over the entire area tonight. Midday temperatures have fallen to the freezing mark in central Indiana, along with some light snow flurries. A few light snow flurries expected to move into southwestern Ohio later this afternoon, but will be of no consequence. Temperatures in Cincinnati will fall to freezing by early evening and to the mid-20s by Sunday morning. At 1 o'clock, it was 38 degrees in Cincinnati. At 2, 36 degrees. Currently, Portsmouth, Ohio, reports 56 degrees, while to the west, Indianapolis reports 33. This is WLW, Cincinnati. Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join with President Johnson in urging Americans to...
Further developments now from the nation's capital as we hear from Robert McCormick in Washington.
And actually, they are coming from Robert Goralski at the White House.
At this moment, newsmen are again watching the north portico of the White House, where members of the Congress, senators, and representatives are arriving to go into the East Room to see President Kennedy lying in repose. Among the various congressmen that we have noted coming in the past few minutes, Senator Humphrey, the Majority Whip, Senator Eastland of Mississippi, the Senate Majority Leader Mike Mansfield of Montana, Senator Hiram Fong of Hawaii, Senator Russell of Georgia, and Senator Claire Engel of California, who has been ill for quite some time, arrived just a few minutes ago. He was in a wheelchair, and he was helped up the stairs and into the White House. This is, I believe, the first public appearance by Senator Engel since he was stricken several months ago. Among the other congressmen I noted, Chet Hollifield of California, Senator Jackson of Washington, Adam Clayton Powell arrived moments ago, Senator Irwin of North Carolina, Ellender of Louisiana. Margaret Chase Smith of Maine arrived just seconds ago, as did her colleague from the state of Maine, Edward Muskie. Senator Kuechel of California is here. I have not seen Senator Barry Goldwater, who's been mentioned most frequently as the 1964 nominee for the Republican Party. Undoubtedly, he will arrive here. All the senators, all the representatives are expected to file into the East Room during the next several hours. President Harry Truman was supposed to have landed at Washington's National Airport about 22 minutes ago. He was flying in from Independence, Missouri, aboard a plane which had been specially provided for him by the White House. And at this moment, President Lyndon Johnson is meeting with the members of his cabinet. This, we understand, is to be a meeting in which the president will tell the cabinet that he wishes them to remain at their posts. Of course, among the members of the cabinet, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, brother of the slain president. And that's the latest here.
It should be reiterated at this point in connection with some of the news that came in a while ago that the State Department earlier today put out a formal statement attributed only to State Department authorities that they have no evidence whatever indicating that any foreign country, the Soviet Union or Cuba or any other foreign country, was involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The statement becomes important because Lee Harvey Oswald, who is charged with the assassination, has had ties with Cuba and, of course, was at one time in Russia. And at the time he went behind the Iron Curtain, he said that he felt as though he were getting out of prison. So the question of whether actually he was motivated or inspired by any foreign government has been a matter of speculation, assuming that he did have something to do with the president's assassination. And now I think I told you before that President Johnson, earlier today, with former President Eisenhower, walked past the casket of the late President Kennedy in the East Room of the White House. He, of course, was but part of a long procession of famous and powerful people who have paid their respects to the President. And the President Johnson and Mrs. Johnson spent 20 minutes with the late President Kennedy's widow, Jacqueline Kennedy, in the White House. Otherwise, President Johnson has kept very busy indeed, taking just a few minutes out to go across Lafayette Park to attend church services at St. John's Episcopal Church, one of the oldest churches in Washington, traditionally known as the Church of the Presidents because it's been attended by almost every man in the White House for about 150 years. And now, apparently, news from the air to Ed Goff at National Airport.
Former President Truman has just arrived here aboard a T-39 Sabreliner jet from the Air Force. He was helped down the steps. He looked, for the first time that I've seen him, he looked like an old man as he came down the stairs. Then he came up to the microphones and had this to say.
Mr. President, can you give us a statement today?
I made 2 statements already today, which you have already had on the radio and the television and everywhere else. But if you want another one, I'll give it to you. Of course, I was shocked.
Wait just a second for the conference out of the way. Well, move a little further.
He's on my side.
Thank you, General. All right, he's going.
Now, what is it you want to know?
Would just give us a statement on your reaction and your arrival and your plans.
Oh, well, I was very much shocked and hurt when I heard of the passing of the President of the United States. He was a good man, an able president, and he did a good job. And it's too bad that those things have to happen, particularly by some good-for-nothing fellow who didn't have anything else to do but to try to take the head of the state away from us. But we have to make those things. It's been done time and again before. It was attempted one time when I remembered very well, but it didn't succeed.
I mentioned
Will you
this
have any advice
you
for
of a
Mr.
time
Johnson?
20 years ago. How can you advise Mr. Johnson as compared to yours?
Mr. Johnson needs any advice, he'll ask me for it. He's the President of the United States. The man doesn't volunteer information to the President unless he asks for it. Too many of you did that to me, and I didn't pay any attention to you.
Have you been asked to call on the President now?
I have not. I have not.
Have you talked to President Johnson since
Yes,
taking
I
office?
have. I've talked to him.
Could you tell us something about the
No,
conversation?
I will not, because that's confidential. You ask the President if you want to find out.
What are your plans right now, sir?
Go to the hotel and sit down if I can. If you guys let me do it.
Thank you, Mr. President.
And we let him go away. I say he looked old, but as you heard, he still has the fire that he's always had. He called the assassin a good-for-nothing who took away our head of state. He reminded us that you don't tell that tells you or asks you your advice. As you heard a little interruption on the tape at the beginning there, that was when the car taking the president, or former president, to the White House or to his hotel, was driven up right between us and the cameraman. You heard the cameraman complaining. That was what that dispute was about. Mr. Truman seemed to enjoy it quite a bit. It was as if he were his old self. At the same time that we were talking to him, we found out later former governor, or rather New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller also arrived at another section of the airport. We tried to rush over and get him and got there in time to see his car moving away. He is also now in Washington. This is Ed Goff, NBC News at Washington National Airport.
Former President Truman's attitude toward the question of whether he had any advice for the new President Johnson is so characteristic of his respect for the office of President. He said, you don't just volunteer information to the President of the United States. If he wants it, he'll ask for it. He is President. He admitted he had talked to President Johnson, but refused to say what. Once again, this is a mark of respect for the office, because by tradition, no conversation with the President is ever released except by the President himself. Sometimes, of course, this is honored in the breach, but that generally is the tradition. And President Truman has always abided by it since he got out of the White House. I think we're, at the moment, cleared up down here. Russ Ward, have you anything there?
Robert, we might mention that Queen Frederica of Greece will attend the funeral services for the President on Monday. New York Stock Exchange will be closed on that day, as will the Midwest Stock Exchange. Of course, all government offices are closed on Monday, now officially proclaimed as a day of mourning by President Johnson. Metropolitan life insurance offices all across the nation will be closed on Monday. Mr. Truman's characterization of Oswald as a good-for-nothing fellow who didn't have anything to do comes at a time when we are piecing together bits of information about this man. He's described as a loner who kept pretty much to himself all his life, one who held radical views but was not regarded as a troublemaker, at least during his early years. That's the portrait of 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald, as we pick up pieces of this young man's life from Dallas and elsewhere. Dallas Police Chief Jesse Curry said Oswald has readily admitted he is a communist, apparently proud of being a communist. He didn't try to hide it, said Curry. Although formally charged with the murder of Mr. Kennedy, Oswald has withstood all efforts by authorities to gain any admission from him of any kind. He has told the newsmen, "I did not kill the president. I did not kill anyone." Oswald has refused to take a lie detector test. He's 24 years old, stands 5 feet 9, weighs 160 pounds, and described as with regular features, straight black hair, cool and defiant as he is held for further questioning in Dallas, often arrogant, with an easy smile, as authorities there say. He was born in New Orleans October 18th, 1939, and said later his father had died before he was born. Police in Dallas have brought in for questioning a second man, Rodriguez Molina, who worked in the same Texas school book depository building used by the sniper yesterday, the same building in which Oswald worked. Police have stressed that Molina came voluntarily. He was not booked, and police have doubted that he was connected with Oswald. They also cleared an unidentified man who drove Oswald to work yesterday. He did volunteer and took a lie detector test. As the nation grieves the tragic events of the last 24 hours, this Saturday afternoon, customarily set aside for a time of scholastic hoopla and football games, many of them now postponed, most of them, in fact, canceled because of the death of the president. The clash for the Big Ten title at East Lansing, Michigan, between Illinois and Michigan State has been postponed to Thanksgiving Day. The decision leaves the Oklahoma-Nebraska clash as the biggest on this Saturday schedule, the game to be to determine the Big 8 representative in the Orange Bowl. There was a trend toward rescheduling to a later date among most colleges. Among the games rescheduled for Thanksgiving are Columbia-Rutgers, the Wisconsin-Minnesota, and the Virginia-Maryland game. Games that were postponed until Saturday, November 30th include the California-Stanford football game, Princeton-Dartmouth, North Carolina-Duke, Oregon State-Oregon, Washington State-Washington, and the UCLA-Southern California game. Pitt-Penn State, Southern Methodist-Baylor, and the Rice-Texas Christian game will be played on December the 7th. The American Football League has postponed all 4 of its games scheduled for tomorrow. National League games will be played, but Commissioner Pete Rozelle has suggested the omission of the usual halftime ceremonies, the entertainment and the team introductions that normally accompany these football games. All 3 Boston professional sports teams have canceled their weekend home engagements out of respect for the president. The Celtics game, scheduled for tonight against the Philadelphia team, and tomorrow's Boston Patriots, Kansas City, and the Boston Bruins, Detroit Red Wings contests also have been postponed. Many stores throughout the nation closed today, will be closed Monday, out of respect for the late president. In Pittsburgh, the 3 major stores plan to remain closed until 2 p.m. Members of the Houston, Texas Retail Merchants Association plan to close all stores until noon. All downtown stores in Columbus, Ohio will be closed until 1 p.m. on Monday. All major Chicago stores plan to close Monday, the day having been declared a national day of mourning by President Lyndon Johnson. Most of the large department stores in New York City also expected to close. The National General Corporation said theaters in 16 western and midwestern states would be closed on Monday until 6 p.m. The chain operates 220 movie houses. Here in New York last night, all theaters closed. The only businesses open were restaurants, and they doing a very slight business as persons who had learned the news had hurried to their homes. This is Russ Ward in the NBC newsroom in New York, bringing you continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. We now go back to Washington for any further developments to be reported by Robert McCormick.
Well, first of all, a reminder that former President Truman has arrived in Washington, and New York's Governor Rockefeller also is here. The dignitaries are coming in at the airport here on what seems an endless procession, all making their way to the White House, of course, to pay their respects to the late President Kennedy. And for more on what is going on at the White House, here again is Robert Goralski.
Former President Truman arrived at the White House just a few minutes ago. He was accompanied by his military aide, General Harry Vaughan. When he arrived at the North Portico, he was greeted by Sergeant Shriver, President Kennedy's brother-in-law, and Andrew Biddleduke, Chief of Protocol for the Department of State. There is indeed a procession here, probably about 25 cars now lined up in the driveway leading to the North Portico. Governor Romney of Michigan arrived a few minutes ago, as did Governor Pat Brown of California. Governor Brown was unsmiling. He said he's still in a state of shock. He found out the news yesterday in Sacramento. He arrived here in Washington about 45 minutes ago. Reverend Braskamp, the chaplain of the House of Representatives, entered the White House to proceed to the East Room. John McClellan, Senator McClellan of Arkansas, William Proxmire of Wisconsin, Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania, Senator John Sparkman of Alabama, once a vice presidential candidate for the Democratic Party, arrived a short time ago. Senator Gore, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr., representative from California, who once lived in this executive mansion, arrived, and Senator Hayden of Arizona. The cars are still moving at a brisk pace. This is the period of the day during this period of mourning when members of the House of Representatives, members of the Senate, the Associate Justices of the Supreme Court of the United States, and others are now moving very, very gradually and moving out of position. Congressman Roosevelt has kindly agreed to step over to our NBC microphones. Mr. Roosevelt, what is your feeling going back to the White House at a time like this?
Well, of course, it's a tragic and sad occasion, and I think both Mrs. Roosevelt and I feel so much sympathy that we really can't find the words to express it. And we only hope that Mrs. Kennedy and the children will be supported by the prayers of all of the American people.
Did you see Mrs. Kennedy at all, sir, while you were in the White House?
No, we did not.
I imagine you can well appreciate this feeling which the First Family is suffering during this period.
Yes. I think that anyone who has lived through something very much like this knows the tremendous strain and the difficulty of adjusting to a situation which just comes on you overnight.
Well, thank you very much, sir.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Congressman James Roosevelt of California, whose father, while he was president, died in office in 1945. Congressman Roosevelt has just been into the East Room of the White House where President Kennedy lies in repose. Well, that's the story here. President Truman is inside. Other congressmen are arriving. The lying in repose will continue until about 6:30 this evening. Robert Goralski, NBC News at the White House.
Earlier, Robert Goralski told us that Senator Claire Engel of California had appeared at the White House. This is, in a sense, most surprising. It's the first public appearance that Senator Engel has made since he had a very serious operation several weeks ago. He came to the White House in a wheelchair. We have been told before by his doctors that he's making a good recovery. The operation was on the brain and apparently had left some impairment of his limbs, and which his doctors were quite sure would be temporary. But Senator Engel has not been on the floor of the Senate for a long, long time, and this is the first we have heard of him for a long, long time. He was rather close to President Kennedy. He was designated generally as a liberal Democrat. And now back to Russ Ward.
The U.S. Flag Foundation announced a short time ago that during the 30-day period of mourning, The U.S. flag must remain at half-staff, rain or shine, until sunset, and can even be displayed after dark if proper illumination is provided. Lawrence Phelps Tower, the president of the foundation, said flags that cannot be half-staffed should have a black streamer from the spearhead halfway down the flag. Other flags hanging horizontally or perpendicularly should have a black bunting border of appropriate depth around the flag. This from the U.S. Foundation. As all public buildings, flying flags at half-staff, the flag over the Capitol building in Washington at half-staff, as the nation joins in this period of mourning. We continue to receive reaction from overseas to the death of the president. The latest from John Chancellor, NBC News in Berlin.
It now appears almost certain that the big square in front of the West Berlin City Hall will be renamed John F. Kennedy Square. The big open area is now known as Rudolf-Wilder-Platz, but in a few days it is expected to be called John F. Kennedy Platz. Mr. Kennedy spent one of the most thrilling hours of his life in this square last June, when he visited Berlin and spoke to the largest crowd of West Berliners ever assembled. To those of us who were here in Berlin that day, it was a triumphant appearance for the president. Some of us who were there on that day returned to the City Hall Square tonight, along with more than 40,000 West Berliners, for a memorial tribute to the late president. It was the second night in a row that the people of West Berlin had so assembled in silent commemoration. Tonight, groups of students carried signs reading, "We have lost a friend." One solemn youth wore a coverlet of flowers, in the middle of which was a picture of Mr. Kennedy and the single word, "Why?" Flares could be seen flickering and candles burning in the windows of buildings around the square. The mayor of West Berlin had suggested to the citizens that they burn candles tonight in memory of the president. And all across West Berlin, the candles are now burning. Last night, some candles were put in windows across the Berlin Wall in East Germany. Mayor Willy Brandt spoke briefly to the crowd in the City Hall Square tonight, speaking from the City Hall steps under a giant photograph taken of Mr. Kennedy on the day he spent in Berlin. The photograph was framed in green and red flowers, and other flowers were strewn across the steps of the City Hall. The giant bell of the City Hall, called the Freedom Bell, a gift to Berlin from the people of the United States, rang deeply for about a minute when the mayor stopped speaking. And after the tolling of the big bell, the meeting ended, but the 40,000 people stood in their places for a moment or two of absolute, dead, total silence. It was an uncanny moment as all those people stood there in complete silence, thinking of John Kennedy and what he and the United States meant to them. Then, across the city in East Berlin, the low, faraway whistle of a railroad train sounded, and the meeting began to break up. The people who had been there had done all they could have done, and they went home realizing that it could never have been enough. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
Further developments from Washington now as we return to NBC's Robert McCormick.
And these developments are at the airport, so we go immediately to Ed Goff in our mobile unit at the National Airport.
Governor George Wallace of Alabama, has just come into the airport here on his way to pay his respects to the late president. Governor Wallace told us that he thinks this is a tragedy for all Americans. He says it transcends all politics. It's a terrible thing when the head of the state is killed, has to die in such a manner. We started to ask him political questions, what he thought his future would be, and so on, and he said, this matter transcends all politics. I am not thinking of politics at this time. Let us not ask political questions. He has now gone on his way to pay his respects. This is Ed Goff, NBC News at National Airport.
The report you heard a few moments ago from Berlin with the traditional candlelight ceremony of the Germans is one of the most moving things that I have ever seen in my entire life. But now, for more immediate problems, back again to Robert Goralski at the White House.
Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York arrived a few moments ago. He came in a very small car not one of the larger limousines which have been parading into the driveway leading to the North Portico, as congressmen and governors of the 50 states and the territories are paying their final respects to the late President Kennedy. There are other figures who have been prominently mentioned in connection with the 1964 Republican presidential nomination. Senator Goldwater, he has not yet arrived. Governor Romney of Michigan has. I don't imagine that the governors and the members of the Congress are spending more than 2 or 3 minutes in the East Room. Many are filing out a back door on the south side of the White House. A few are coming out to an area just a short distance away from our position here. In addition to the names that have been mentioned in connection with 1964 and Republican politics, as Ed Goff mentioned a moment ago, George Wallace has arrived here. He'll be one of the governors paying their last respects to President Kennedy. We've had no information yet on Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi, who was also tangled in a way during the period with the administration. Both Barnett and Wallace apparently now willing to forget about past problems and pay homage to the late president. Bob, I have nothing more from here except to add that there are probably about 250 people across Pennsylvania Avenue now. The rain has stopped, and larger numbers of people are gathering, just standing there motionless, peering at the North Portico and the line of dignitaries who are marching into the East Room.
Well, gentlemen, I know that you'll bear with us, and I'm sure our audience will too, because we have a message for the many NBC stations across the country. The following is a note for these stations. For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose at 5 minutes before the hour and the half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period, and the following will be the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. That's the message for our stations, and we hope that you will bear with us while we give them that information.
Continuing reaction from around the world to the tragedy that struck the United States yesterday with the death of the president, the Cambodian government today asked the local press there to observe an absolute truce and to stop attacks against the United States for the next 3 days in mourning for President Kennedy. Prince Norodom Sihanouk's government issued an official communique saying Cambodia wished to join the United States in its hour of grief. Cambodia asked local newspapers and radio stations to refrain from all forms of attack against, quote, this great nation during the 3-day period of mourning. The Cuban press headlined the news of President Kennedy's assassination. None made any comment or carried statements of officials in Havana. Only the expression of sympathy made in the United Nations yesterday by Ambassador Carlos Lechuga was published. The newspapers published long biographies of President Kennedy and of his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson. And even as we hear these reactions from all parts of the world, our attention turns to Dallas, Texas, where police continue to question 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald. Defense Department records show us that Oswald, the man charged with the assassination of the president, qualified as a sharpshooter with the rifle when he was in the Marine Corps. This is the second rank in the 3 gradings of shooting ability. The lowest is marksman, next sharpshooter, and then the highest-ranking expert. Oswald, however, just barely made the sharpshooter qualifying score of 210 to 219. His score was 212 in that test. Police have reported a rifle was used in the shooting of the president, and further examinations by FBI experts on the scene have proved that Oswald had fired a rifle a short time before the death of the president. Oswald has denied any part in the assassination. He further denied that he had killed a Dallas, Texas policeman a few hours after Mr. Kennedy was shot. He has refused to take a lie detector test.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
WLW, Cincinnati. Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation ask that you join in a prayer for the consolation of the bereaved family of President Kennedy and for the guidance of President Johnson.
When Mrs. Rose Kennedy attended 2 masses, she left the church to go back to their home at Hyannisport to inform her husband, Joseph P. Kennedy, that their son had been killed by an assassin's bullet. The elder Kennedy's reaction was not known outside that sprawling White House overlooking Nantucket Sound, where he and the president had sailed in happier days. Perhaps indicative that the father took the news hard was the apparent delay in the family's previously indicated plans to fly to Washington soon thereafter. Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's 72-year-old mother, attending 2 masses in St. Xavier's Roman Catholic Church, then returning to their Cape Cod family compound, where she told her husband what the world already had known for almost 20 hours, that their son had been killed. 4 more now from the nation's capital. Robert McCormick in Washington.
And we have had a report just come in, so we will switch now immediately to Richard Harkness at Andrews Air Force Base.
We'll be back to Washington in a few moments when a little line trouble is cleared up. Right now I can pass along to you this report from Robert Abernathy at the Capitol, that when President Kennedy's body is brought there tomorrow, it will be carried up the main east front steps and placed in the rotunda on a black velvet-draped bier. The bier normally kept in the sub-basement of the Capitol. It was built originally to support the body of Abraham Lincoln, which also lay in state in the rotunda. The rotunda will be open to the public all tomorrow afternoon until 9 tomorrow night, and again from 9 until 10 a.m. Monday morning. We go now back to Washington and Robert McCormick.
I believe our troubles have been cleared up now, so we try once again for Richard Harkness at Andrews Air Force Base.
Richard Harkness down there. Nice to see you again, sir. It's good to see you.
Governor, generally, could you tell us what is the general reaction in Mississippi to the president's death?
People of Mississippi were very, very extremely sorry to learn of his assassination. I think it was indeed a cowardly act, and the people of Mississippi are certainly in deep mourning and grief. I had the flags flown at half-mast from the moment I learned of it. As soon as I learned of his death, why, I was in Aberdeen, Mississippi, making a talk at a civic club, and I immediately wired Mrs. Kennedy of our very deepest sympathies, wired the governor of Texas, Governor Conway, that we deeply sympathize with him in his injuries. At first, we understood that President Lyndon Johnson was shot, but we soon learned that he was not.
Governor, you have just mentioned President Johnson. He is well known, of course, in your state, is
yes,
he not?
He's very well known in Mississippi.
When you were making your way through Jackson and Aberdeen since yesterday afternoon when the shooting took place, did you get comments from the people or visuals?
Yes, sir, I had comments from quite a number of people. At Aberdeen, Mississippi, Mr. Peter Colfax, president of the American Potash and Chemical Corporation, They have just put the third plant in Aberdeen. He expressed grief and sorrow as a result of this tragedy. I think that every Mississippian is indeed sorry. In fact, I know that they are all deeply grieved over this tragedy.
The Governor, looking to the future, do you see any change now in administration policy? And put this question to you this way, sir, in relations with the South.
What do you mean by change in administrative policy?
Well, I was thinking, of course, basically upon the differences which the South has had with the Kennedy administration.
Yes. Well, I couldn't answer that at this time. I wouldn't know. The people of the South, of course, are firm in their convictions. We had a lot of respect for Kennedy, of course. We didn't agree with him on everything. But I think Kennedy was a man of a lot of courage. And he had the courage of his convictions. And I think he was a very brilliant man.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Governor Ross Barnett of Mississippi, who has just arrived in Washington for this weekend of paying the respects and then the funeral of the late President Kennedy. Other governors have arrived here today from across the country in their planes. Carl Rollback, the governor of Minnesota, Endicott Peabody of Massachusetts, the close friend of the late president. Governor King of New Hampshire, and then the governors Morrison of Nebraska, Hughes of Iowa, Welch of Indiana, Reed of Maine, Reynolds of Wisconsin, and Governor Love of Colorado, among the other state executives who have come today to Andrews Air Force Base from across the country. This is Richard Harkness, NBC News at Andrews Air Force Base.
And so the stream of powerful people of all political complexions continues into Washington to pay final respects to the late President Kennedy. They are coming in in ones and twos and in groups of a dozen at a time. In the meantime, President Johnson, who feels very keenly the horror of the assassination of the president, nevertheless is obliged to go ahead with the routine work of the government. And so now back to New York.
As this story of respect and tribute unfolds in Washington, there are continuing developments in Dallas, where the assassination took place. And for the latest there, we go to Tom Perryman, station WFAA in Dallas.
We have information now from the Dallas Police Headquarters. One of our men reports a taxi cab driver is now being questioned. The cab driver is alleged to have picked up Oswald, the accused slayer of President Kennedy, somewhere between the area where President Kennedy was shot and Oak Cliff, his home. The suspect, Oswald, is alleged to have taken a bus about halfway to his home in Oak Cliff, just across the river from the downtown Dallas area, where he took a cab from there to his home. He changed clothes there and went to the theater a short time later. Also from Dallas, the county judge, Lou Sterrett, is going to meet with the mayor, Earl Cabell, as soon as he can, possibly today or tomorrow. He is proposing the erection of a monument at the spot or near the spot where John Fitzgerald Kennedy was assassinated in downtown Dallas. This is Tom Perryman at WFAA reporting for NBC News.
We also repeat a story received from the Defense Department earlier, that Oswald, Lee Harvey Oswald, the man being held, once wrote to Texas Governor John Connally from Russia, pleading that his undesirable discharge be reversed. The exact date of that letter not known, but presumably it was while Connally was serving as President Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. All of which raises a new question whether the real target of the assault was Mr. Kennedy or Governor Connally. The two were riding with their wives in the presidential car when 3 shots rang out from that high-powered rifle from a high-level window overlooking the parade route. Mr. Connally was seriously injured, but is in satisfactory condition now. The president, of course, killed in that assault. Now, a statement from former Vice President Richard Nixon.
President Kennedy yesterday wrote the final and greatest chapter in his profiles of courage. Today, millions of people throughout the world are trying to find words adequate to express their grief and their sympathy to his family. I think the greatest tribute that could be paid to his memory is for each of us in our everyday lives to do everything we can to reduce the hatred that has driven men to such terrible deeds.
Mr. Kennedy's funeral set for noon Monday at St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington. At those solemn ceremonies, France to be represented by President Charles de Gaulle, Britain by Prince Philip and Prime Minister Sir Alec Douglas-Home, West Germany by Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, heads of government and heads of state from many other countries coming to Washington to pay tribute to the late president. At 1 o'clock tomorrow, to the muffled cadence of a corps of drummers, the body in its heavy mahogany casket will be borne from the White House to the Capitol on a caisson drawn by 7 horses. There it will lie in state in the Capitol Rotunda until 11 o'clock Monday. It will then be moved to St. Matthew's, a few miles away, for the Pontifical Requiem Mass that will be celebrated by Richard Cardinal Cushing, the Archbishop of Boston. Exact burial plans have not been made public by the White House. Burial is expected to be at the family plot in Brookline, Massachusetts. At Hyannisport today, Mrs. Rose Kennedy, the president's mother, had the unhappy task of informing her husband, Joseph P. Kennedy, that their son had been killed by an assassin's bullet. There is no word from Hyannisport as to the reaction of the elder Mr. Kennedy. In Washington, persons paying their respects to the fallen president on a rainy day, the East Room of the White House, the scene of blackest mourning. Further developments now as we return to Washington and NBC's Robert McCormick. We'll go back to Washington a few moments from now. I might read to you a few words of the proclamation delivered by President Lyndon Johnson today on the occasion of the death of Mr. Kennedy. Said the new president, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States, has been taken from us by an act which outrages decent men everywhere. He upheld the faith of our fathers, which is freedom for all men. He broadened the frontiers of that faith and backed it with the energy and the courage which are the mark of the nation he led. A man of wisdom, strength, and peace, he molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death. Those words in the proclamation issued today by the new President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson. And this just in from Dallas, Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz said today, the assassination case against Lee Harvey Oswald is cinched. He said flatly, this is the man that killed President Kennedy. 24-year-old Lee Harvey Oswald being held in Dallas, Texas, for the assassination of the president. Now we try again for NBC's Robert McCormick in Washington.
Robert McCormick is taking a brief time off. This is Edwin Newman. What were you hoping to hear from us? Reaction perhaps to the news that the police officer in Dallas has said that the case against Oswald is cinched. That is a rather extraordinary thing to say at a time like this, and they must have certainly what evidence they consider conclusive against Oswald. I wonder what they have learned that they did not tell us about earlier. Have you heard anything on that?
Edwin, we're waiting for pickup now from Dallas on this later development. It does seem a little odd that the case is cinched this early.
They have perhaps made other tests. They had given us earlier, you remember, the results of the paraffin tests on the hands. They had not given us the result of the paraffin tests on the face. The tests on the hands had shown, they said, that Oswald had fired a rifle. The tests on the face presumably would have shown something more.
knowing the speed with which both the Secret Service and the FBI acted following the assassination, I assume the word we get from Dallas is one of some authenticity.
Oh, yes, that is the homicide chief in Dallas. Russ, let me interrupt you. Robert Goralski at the White House has something to say. Let's go to Goralski.
President Johnson held his first cabinet meeting here this afternoon. It lasted about 25 minutes. It began with a minute of silent prayer led by President Johnson. President Johnson asked the cabinet to remain with him, and responding for the entire cabinet was Secretary of State Dean Rusk and the United Nations Ambassador Adlai Stevenson. They replied that they would stay on so long as President Johnson wanted them to remain in office, so long as he wants them to stay on. This was the first cabinet meeting held by President Johnson. There's every indication that there were no formal resignations submitted, and that President Johnson will retain all the men who had served under the late President Kennedy. It's also known that President Johnson called the widow of the police officer, Officer Tippett, who was killed yesterday in Dallas, along with Mr. Kennedy. President Johnson had a telephone conversation with former governor of Pennsylvania, Lawrence, who is now the executive secretary of the President's Commission on Equal Opportunities in Housing, and presumably he asked Governor Lawrence to stay on in that position. At 4:45 this afternoon, President Johnson will have a meeting with former President Truman. At 5 o'clock this afternoon, he's expected to leave his office, concluding his first day in office as President of the United States. And that's it from here, Ed. Any questions, or is that it?
No questions, Bob. I just want to say that we've had a further statement from the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Will Fritz, the man who said the assassination case against Oswald was cinched, and who said this man killed President Kennedy. He also said, without going into the evidence, I can tell you this. This case is cinched. This man killed President Kennedy. We are convinced without any doubt he did the killing. There were no accomplices. So the homicide chief of the Dallas police has said that he is convinced that Lee Harvey Oswald killed President Kennedy and that he did it without help from anyone else. Now, Russ, earlier today they had revealed that they had arrested a second man and were questioning him. Do you judge from this, then, that they have deduced that the second man was not connected with the crime?
Ed, allow me to interrupt you. We go right now to Tom Pettit with later developments on this story. Tom Pettit in Dallas.
Here's an example of the detail work going on. Captain Will Fritz of Homicide, who's heading the investigation, said they now have found out that Oswald left the book depository store from which the fatal bullets were fired at President Kennedy, that he's headed toward home, that he first took a bus, finding it too slow, switched to a cab. Then he went to his apartment, changed clothes, and went to the movie theater, where he later was apprehended after allegedly killing a Dallas police officer. They have located the cab driver. They have located the bus driver. These are two of the many witnesses who are being interrogated in building the case. Fritz, in his first appearance a few moments ago before newsmen, said it is a cinch case. This is Captain Fritz, head of the homicide squad, who's been conducting the investigation and interrogation. Captain, can you give us a resume of what you now know concerning the assassination of the president and Mr. Oswald's role in it?
There's only one thing that I can tell you, without going into the evidence. Before first talking to the district attorney, I can tell you that this case is cinched, that this man killed the president.
Captain Fritz says it is a cinch case. District Attorney Wade was asked if he thinks it is a cinch case. He said that there is no such thing when there are 12 jurors involved, but it is, he says, a very good case against Lee Oswald. This is Tom Pettit, NBC News, reporting from Dallas Police Headquarters.
So you have just heard a pickup from Dallas with NBC's Tom Pettit, in which homicide chief Captain Will Fritz said today the assassination case against the president is cinched, that Lee Harvey Oswald is the man who killed the president. Again, we are quoting homicide chief Captain Will Fritz. The governor of New York, Nelson Rockefeller, has proclaimed a 30-day period of mourning out of respect to the chief executive who was killed yesterday. Governor Richard Hughes of New Jersey today issued an executive order closing all state offices in New Jersey on Monday, also proclaiming a 30-day period of mourning. In his executive order, Governor Hughes said all citizens of the state are requested on this day of mourning and prayer to limit their business and commercial activities to the greatest extent possible. Further developments from Washington now as we go back to Edwin Newman.
Russ, I wanted to put a question to you that I hoped you might be able to put to Tom Pettit. We have had the statement of the homicide chief in Dallas, Captain Fritz, that the case is a cinch. It has been cinched, and that Oswald is the man who killed President Kennedy, and that he did it alone. There were no accomplices. Has Tom Pettit, and I know what difficulties he's laboring under, been able to get any kind of indication from the people in charge of the case as to what the motivation of Oswald was? You suggested earlier this afternoon that it was at least conceivable that it was Governor Connolly of Texas against whom Oswald was acting, if indeed he did act. Have you heard anything more about that?
We have not, Edwin. The basis for that speculation comes from Dallas, and it is based on the fact that Oswald had written a letter to Connolly at an unspecified time, possibly while Connolly was serving as President Kennedy's Secretary of the Navy, in which Oswald is said to have objected strenuously to some ill deed he felt was done to him while he was in uniform. Apparently, he held the governor of Texas responsible for this, and there has been the suggestion that perhaps Connolly was the target for the assassination bullet. Again, we must repeat that Oswald declares his innocence. He has not confessed to anything. He has declined to take a lie detector test. And while Homicide Chief Fritz has said the case is cinched, Oswald himself says he is innocent, and the man has not yet gone to trial. So we simply pass along the latest development we get from Dallas. On the question of evidence, we have expect to hear from Pettit again momentarily, in which perhaps we can get further elaboration on that. I would assume, Edwin, that any additional evidence that may be held against Oswald will be held until the case comes to trial, that they certainly would not want to try the case on radio or television.
No, quite. They must hold the evidence, and I suppose there would be people in other countries whose judicial and legal systems are different from ours who would be shocked that even this statement has been made, that the police officer in charge of the case says, in effect, that Oswald is guilty. There are other countries that would not permit that to be said, would not permit us to say it on radio or television or in the newspapers.
It does seem unusual in that but there's a possibility of a mistrial when such statements are made before the man goes before a jury.
I suppose we're getting perhaps too far ahead of the story, but I suppose Oswald's lawyer would almost automatically say it would be difficult, if not impossible, for him to get a fair trial in view of everything that has been said. Still, it is part of our legal system to see to it that he does get a fair trial, and as you have emphasized, and rightly, he is innocent until proved guilty.
We might mention in this connection, Edwin, allow me to interrupt, that
please,
with the nationwide publicity that has been given Oswald's arrest, a change of venue would seem to me, and I speak strictly from the viewpoint of a layman, a change of venue would be impossible. That the name Lee Harvey Oswald is known now from coast to coast. Is there such a thing as granting a impartial jury to this man anywhere in the country?
Well, I think we may say this, that in a case of the surpassing importance and somberness that this one will have, whoever might be tried in connection with such a crime, any jury would surely want to give the most sober sort of attention to to the case before it. I think any jury would go into such a case with the most serious intentions and with the deepest responsibilities, and we should be able to count on that.
Edwin, allow me to interrupt this just a moment now. As we get further developments from abroad, we go to John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
From our vantage point here in West Berlin, several important themes of communist reaction emerged today in connection with the death of the president. The point of most immediate importance to the people of the United States is that the Cold War apparently is not going to turn hot overnight because John F. Kennedy is gone and Lyndon Johnson has taken his place. There are several reasons for this. One is the great length to which Premier Khrushchev of the Soviet Union has gone to demonstrate publicly sorrow and shock over the death of the president. He was echoed in these demonstrations by the highest range of Soviet officials, including an influential and unofficial personality, Mrs. Khrushchev. Premier Khrushchev went beyond telegraphing his condolences today. Moscow let it be known that he returned to Moscow especially from an out-of-town trip so that he could call on the American ambassador for a personal demonstration of his feelings. On top of that, the Soviets are sending First Deputy Premier Anastas Mikoyan to President Kennedy's funeral. Mikoyan serves a double purpose. He is an old and canny Armenian negotiator who has always got along very well with Americans, and he is a man of exalted rank in the Soviet hierarchy. Moreover, the governmental leaders of the East Bloc satellites and their propaganda organizations have been relatively profuse in their messages of condolence and their reporting of the president's death. This applies to some very tough characters in the communist world, including Antonin Novotny of Czechoslovakia and Walter Ulrich of East Germany. Both have sent messages to Washington, and the leading newspaper in East Germany, Neues Deutschland, turned over a remarkably large portion of its front page today to the Kennedy story. In Moscow, the Russians have borrowed film of Mr. Kennedy from the American embassy vaults, and a special obituary program on the late president is now being prepared for Moscow television. President Johnson is described in Moscow tonight as more conservative than Mr. Kennedy, but Moscow says that the policies of the Kennedy administration will be continued. Among other important things to recall, however, about the communist position is the fact, which must be exceedingly uncomfortable to communist propagandists, the fact that the man accused of murdering Mr. Kennedy has described himself as a Marxist and, according to one report, as a communist. Furthermore, the man has lived in the Soviet Union, reportedly sought Soviet citizenship, and married a Russian girl. Now, this poses a propaganda hurdle of gigantic magnitude for the communists, who were very quick off the mark to charge that the president had been killed by a right-wing American racist. So far, the communists have not tried to get over the hurdle, and no one in the Soviet Union, for example, has been told in any specific way of these details about Lee Harvey Oswald. But the voice of America is no longer jammed in Russia, and the people of that country are bound to get the word one way or another. So the Russians have a bad problem. They are beginning to work at a solution. Both the Soviet news agency TASS and Moscow Radio Home Service have called the case against Oswald a suspicious one, and they are jibing about the so-called police story of left-wing elements being involved, end quote. Finally, in their eulogies to the president, the universal communist line is that the world has lost a man who was working toward a relaxation of international tension. And of course, so he was. But by this tactic, the communists are making it possible to say, look, we got along with President Kennedy, and we said so when he died, but we can't get along with President Johnson. The Russians can say that if they want to. We don't know if they will or not. All we can say now is that on the basis of the evidence here tonight, the Cold War will not get a lot hotter tomorrow. John Chancellor, NBC News, Berlin.
This is Edwin Newman in the NBC newsroom in New York. Ellie Abel is here with a late report about the funeral plans, the burial plans for President Kennedy.
Up to now, there has been no decision announced on where the president is to be buried. It had been assumed he would be buried in the family plot at Brookline, Massachusetts, where he was born. However, we've just had a report that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, his brother, was at Arlington National Cemetery this morning, escorted by Defense Secretary McNamara, looking at potential grave sites. So there is this possibility, still unconfirmed, that the president will be buried in the National Cemetery. He is, of course, an accredited and decorated hero from his service in the Navy during the war, and if buried there, would lie alongside so many of his comrades in arms of World War II.
If the president were buried in Arlington, Elliot would emphasize what so many people have said, that he did die on duty and in the course of duty.
It would indeed, and would remove the whole business from the private family context and put him in a national shrine.
I think nobody obviously would object to there being a private family service and burial, and if the president were buried in a family plot, nobody would object. But I think there is there not, a great feeling that the president belongs to the nation.
I'm sure of that, and I'm sure also the decision will be made primarily by Mrs. Kennedy and his brothers.
If he were buried in Arlington, is there now a suitable plot that exists? Would something special have to be set up?
Well, there are plots available for war veterans, and he, of course, qualified. As I said earlier, all we know for certain is that the Attorney General and the Secretary of Defense were at Arlington today and looked at a number of sites, presumably some of the choicer ones.
Ellie, I wish you would join in. I think John Chancellor is on the circuit in Berlin and has had some very interesting things to say about the way in which the communists are reacting, and particularly the Russians are reacting to the death of President Kennedy. John, you said the Soviet government was sending Anastas Mikoyan to represent it at the funeral of President Kennedy. The last time Mikoyan was here was over the Cuba affair. He had to pick up the pieces for Khrushchev after that one.
And was sent to Cuba, by the way, to try to persuade Castro.
Also went to Cuba to pick up the pieces with Castro.
Well, Edwin, I would, if you'll allow me, submit the idea that Anastas Mikoyan, although he may have come here on a difficult errand in connection with the Cuban crisis, has always got along reasonably well with Americans. I think that...
Oh, yes, I think he was sent here at the time of the Cuban crisis because he got along well with Americans. I was only remarking that, he obviously has such a record and such a reputation.
And also, he's a man of considerable rank in the Soviet Union.
I was struck by something you were saying before, John. We on this side, many people on this side, have been worried about the possibility that the Cold War would get hot because of what had happened, and your view and the view of most people is that that is unlikely. It will not get appreciably hotter. But from what you said, I have the impression that the Russians are somewhat worried also, and possibly more worried than we are. Is that a fair statement?
Worried about the effects of the change in administration?
Yes, because the unknown, after all, is on this side, if it is unknown, rather than on their side.
Well, I have no way of knowing what is in Mr. Khrushchev's mind, but it seems to me that they had been able to work out some reasonable agreements with him. They were small, but they were leading in a particular direction. And now, of course, they have quite another quantity to deal with, another human being with a different political chemistry. And I think, however, the general view here, Edwin, is that the technicians and some of the not absolutely top-level policymakers will now take over for a while. This would indeed have happened in the Soviet Union had Khrushchev died suddenly, that the apparatus or establishment takes over for a while because it's very technical and complicated to be a single leader, as Kennedy was, in a sense, and as Khrushchev. And I think Ellie would agree that the role of Dean Rusk in the course of American policy and foreign affairs has been amplified and magnified by this.
Would you agree, Ellie, that Secretary of State Rusk's role is much larger now, especially early in the Johnson administration?
Yes, I would have to agree.
President Johnson has sat in over the past 3 years on a great many important policy discussions, but he has not made the kinds of decisions that a president does make. There's no way of training for that kind of job in advance. My guess is that he will lean rather heavily on Secretary of State Rusk and Defense Secretary McNamara and others who over the past 3 years have shared the President Kennedy's burden in making these decisions.
And, Edwin, if I can come in on what Ellie said, for the reason that the known quantities of McNamara and Rusk and a number of other people, that if they have a heavier role in this, they are rather well known and are not likely to go off in a dangerous course from a Soviet or a communist point of view, and therefore I don't think there is any high-level apprehension in Moscow tonight.
John Chancellor, allow me to interrupt just a moment here. This is Russ Ward in New York. I was intrigued by your statement of a moment ago that the communist bloc nations now are allowing VOA broadcasts to get in unjammed. What significance do you attribute to that?
Well, it's part of the general easing of tensions in teeny-weeny little steps, if you want to use an untechnical phrase, that we have achieved over the past year or so with the Soviet Union. And the foreign broadcasts, I believe the Russian language broadcasts are no longer jammed in the Soviet Union. And when the Voice of America broadcasts the details on the man who is accused of murdering the president, they do so much as we do in the United States. We say what we know about him, and therefore I believe that's getting through. This, of course, means that the Russians no longer live in a hermetically sealed society, that they can get these programs if they want to go to a little trouble to get them, and it means that the Russians are going to have to work out a rationale. They came out very quickly. With the minute they learned the pigmentation of that killer in Dallas, Moscow began talking about right-wing elements. And so I might point out that a lot of people in Britain and Germany and France and everywhere else, and editorial writers in newspapers, communist and non-communist, began digging out the files on what they'd done to Adlai Stevenson in Dallas, and this about Dallas and the rest about Dallas. The Soviet propaganda apparatus, working with these materials, very early on in the game, implied fully in their statements and coverage of this that the deed had been done by somebody of the extreme right who was angry with Kennedy for his position on the color problem in the United States. Now they've got to find a way of taking that back and acknowledging somehow to their own people the fact that this man once lived in the Soviet Union, requested Soviet citizenship, married a Russian girl.
John, State Department authorities said earlier today, and perhaps Ellie Abel will have more on this, said they have no evidence indicating the involvement of the Soviet Union or any other foreign power in the assassination of the president. I wonder if this news has been consumed by the Russian people. Has this been made available in the Russian broadcasts?
I don't know. I would venture to say not in the order of these things. That might be used later by Moscow radio or by home service Russian radio, but at this point I don't believe, although I don't have the transcript of their broadcast, that it so far has been used.
Edwin Newman, do you have anything further now from Washington?
I have a question for John. I hope he's still there. John, have you heard anything about communist Chinese reaction to this?
Yes, and I'm trying to think, Ed. The Chinese...
They have been quite restrained, I believe.
They have been extremely restrained, and they are not dealing with the Kennedy story. They are dealing with the Kennedy story, but they are playing it far down in their newscasts, I believe, and are giving it an unimportant position in their newspapers. The importance of that, it seems to me, is the fact that the entire tier of communist states and the Soviet Union itself, which we observe from Berlin, have given a very prominent display to the Kennedy story, and the Chinese are just not doing so.
The view of the Chinese, then, one might judge, is that this really doesn't matter to them. It's not going to make any significant difference to them, and I suppose they would extend from that it should not make any significant difference to any other communist countries, Russia included.
Well, I think from a dogmatic point of view, that's absolutely true. That the Americans are depicted as the international gendarmes, no matter who happens to be at the head of the nation, and that capitalism is a particular kind of evil, no matter how it is clothed or who heads it. So I would say, in that sense, yes. I wonder if I might put in a question here to you or to Ellie or to Russ, if it isn't a little bit of showing off, in a way, of taking a story about the death of an American president, which is something that's pretty important to an awful lot of people, including an awful lot of Chinese, and being deliberately insulting about it in a particular way by playing such an important story in such a small way. Are there any thoughts on that?
Well, my first thought on it would be what I have already said, which is that it would be part of the Chinese ideological argument that, in fact, the identity of the President of the United States doesn't really matter to them, that there are, in the first place, larger forces at work, and in the second place, that no possible change that could come about in the United States in personalities would make that, would have that great an effect on policy. I don't think that the Chinese can comfortably argue that a mere change in personality can eliminate what they would have to say are fundamental differences between them and us. And I think they would be obliged to say that the United States is trying to destroy China. That is what they do say. I think, therefore, it is ideologically, communistically, Marxist, Leninistically impossible for them to concede that it makes any difference. That is an awful thing to say, but I think it's true. Ellie, you want to say something?
Well, I think the Chinese, as at present the orthodox party in the communist dispute, have to take the position that the United States is an imperialist power whose policies are determined by monopoly capitalists, as they call them, in this country. And they have argued for a very long time that the personality and leanings of the president are quite irrelevant, that imperialists behave like imperialists, no matter who happens to be sitting in the White House. The interesting thing is that the Russians, on the other hand, have been playing this rather differently. Mr. Khrushchev, who'd been missing for several days, and unreported at least, appeared this morning at Spaso House wearing a black suit, signed the book of condolences that Ambassador Kohler had set up at the door, talked privately with Kohler, sent messages to the new president and to the widow Kennedy, expressing his sorrow and that of the peoples of the Soviet Union over the death of a man whom he described as having worked so hard for peace. I think this is an indication in a rather a human vein at the moment, because of the tragedy of the president's death, of the rather different way these are able to behave.
And it is, in a way, I suppose, another bone of contention between them, that the Chinese might well feel that the way in which the Russians are conducting themselves is not a way for a communist power to conduct itself.
Are we holding a lot of people up, or could I ask a question?
Russ Ward, I think you're in command. Are we holding other people up?
We're holding no one up, and the microphone is yours, John.
Well, I'd like to ask all of you what reaction you had, and I haven't been able to hear the coverage, so perhaps you've gone through this, but the original reaction you had when you learned of the president's death, did you feel that suddenly that the Russians might do something, that the Russians might take advantage of the fact that he'd just been killed to do some awful and not really well-defined thing to us? Was there any feeling like that in the United States?
Russ, why don't you answer that?
I don't think so, John. I think this country has a history of bipartisan support in most foreign policy, certainly in our dealings with the Soviet Union. I think the death of the president was more a personal thing, not one that could be translated in terms of what do we do now in Berlin, or what do we do now about Formosa, or what do we do about the Soviet Union or Cuba. I think that by and large, everyone in official Washington and everyone else is dedicated to the freedom of Berlin, is dedicated to the freedom of this country in its fight against international communism. I don't think for a minute that there were thoughts of sudden collapse of our foreign policy. Ellie, you probably have more to say on that than any of us.
Russ, Ellie's had to go has had to answer a call. He has a number of people on the line from whom he's getting information. I think the answer to my answer to John's question would be that at the time President Kennedy was killed, I do not believe that anybody thought that any foreign power had anything to do with it. At least I don't know of anybody who thought that. I didn't hear it suggested. I think a great many people had the same reaction, that the same feeling that the Russians so apparently unwisely did, that it was something that came from perhaps the extreme right, somebody crazed but on the extreme right. That was a reading that, so far at least, appears to have been false. But I think since everybody was stunned and astonished and at first unbelieving, that it didn't occur to anyone that this might be any sort of international plot, or that the Russians would try to take advantage of it, because that would be too transparent a thing and too dangerous a thing to do. Anybody who tried to take advantage of it might well be associated in the public mind with the idea that they were responsible for it.
Edwin and John, too, the immediate reaction that I heard in Washington was one that possibly it was a person who was irate over President Kennedy's civil rights program. As it turns out, if what we hear from Dallas is true, this seemed to have a negligible role in what took place, if any role at all.
I'd like to rephrase my question, if I may. I didn't mean to imply when I said it, prompting these interesting and significant answers of yours, that I had believed that the Soviet Union had any, causal relationship with the shooting, but I was interested in the attitude of the American people. We tend, under our system, more and more nuclear weapons make us do this, I believe, to think of the president as a man who has a button, and if he presses that button, all kinds of things go off, and we're in a war, and that Khrushchev has a button. And when one of the two men in the world who control these enormous arsenals of nuclear weapons dies, and there is this moment of uncertainty that follows his death about, excuse me for phrasing it this way, but who's got the button? Did any of these thoughts go through the minds of people you knew, or your own minds? And I'm not talking now vis-a-vis the Russians or any plot or any foreign policy things. You see what I'm getting at, Edwin?
I see what you're getting at, John, and I do not know of anybody to whom that idea occurred, with the exception of the Germans, apparently, who took certain precautionary measures and put their armed forces, so we understand from Wells, hanging on a very high alert called Alert 1. That is, I suppose, a reasonable enough precaution to take when you are that close and when you don't know what is happening. But I am not aware of anybody who thought that the Russians would try to exploit this. What I was trying to say before was that I think the danger of trying to exploit it would have been overwhelming. I think anybody who tried to exploit it might have been accused of being responsible for it. In any case, I don't think anybody could try to exploit it without running the gravest sort of risks. Of course, we did have Pearl Harbor. People don't always stop to tell you what they intend to do to you. But the danger of the scope of the size of the reaction now is so much greater and so much more lethal that it is hard to see anybody doing anything of a risky nature.
Well, then what we're really saying, I think, is that the securities and the dangers of the world situation are really so gigantic now that the death of one man, no matter how much we may miss him, are not really going to change that balance.
They may not change it immediately, John. It is possible that they will change it in a variety of subtle ways later on because of shifting weights, shifting authorities within the, within the Western Alliance. That if, for example, President Johnson should be a less effective leader than President Kennedy has been, if American influence in the alliance should wane, if issues should arise between our allies and ourselves that cannot be resolved and that make tempers shorter on both sides, all of those things could certainly affect the future, and so the passing of President Kennedy could certainly affect the future. I think There was also something you mentioned before, that now the personal chemistry between Mr. Johnson and Khrushchev comes into the picture.
Well,
right?
yes,
Go ahead,
I think
please. What I was going to say was that President Kennedy and Mr. Khrushchev knew each other quite well, and apparently understood each other reasonably well. At least they have for the last year.
Well, they were in, to use again a non-technical term, they were pen pals. They had met, as I recall, only once at Vienna. Isn't that right?
Yes, at Vienna.
And in a very strained meeting, which I remember being there, and how we all recall how shocked and how sober the president was when he came away from that meeting. And actually, I think you're quite right in what you say, however, is that they had learned one another in a very interesting and in a kind of an intimate way. And the chemistry is going to have to be reworked again. Isn't that what you mean?
Yes, and we don't know what will come out of that. You were at Vienna, so was I, and as you say, the president was shaken and shocked, and must have been greatly saddened, but also made quite determined by what he learned there. But I think if we look back on that, we will believe that that was Khrushchev trying to take Mr. Kennedy's measure. We may now have to wait, if Khrushchev is so inclined, for him to take Mr. Johnson's measure. And until he does, we may not be able to know how well they're going to get along. And how well they get along will have a great deal to do with the future of all of us.
I agree absolutely, and would only add to that when I was talking about the death of one man not changing the balances of the world, I meant that, of course, quite in the present.
Yes.
John, before we lose you here, speaking of this personal chemistry that you and Edwin were talking about a minute ago, how would you define the chemistry between Lyndon Johnson and the people of West Berlin? Do they feel they have as strong a friend in Lyndon Johnson as they had in John F. Kennedy?
Well, the answer is, it really has to be a two-part answer. The first is no. Their manifestation of affection for Kennedy has been phenomenal. Last night at 1 a.m, we had 40,000 people in a torchlight ceremony here in front of the City Hall, and I defy you to find any city in the world last night, including Washington, D.C. or Boston, where 40,000 people gathered together in mute adoration of a man. So I think that no one could take his place in their hearts in this emotional week or weekend. Now, I remember Lyndon Johnson when he was sent here after the wall went up in Berlin, and he was here on the 19th of August, 1961, as a demonstration of American support. Then, at that point, he was, I believe, very effective with the people of West Berlin. We had been up to see the wall. The caravan turned and came back toward the center of Berlin, and Lyndon Johnson, then the vice president, was riding in a closed car. The people of Berlin, in that terribly emotional week when the wall went up, were lining the streets of Berlin, West Berlin, and he felt that, and the kind of again, if we're talking about chemistry, overcame him, and also his very natural inclination to politic wherever he is. He asked his driver to stop the car, and he got out, and of course there was a mob scene, and he walked for 3 or 4 blocks down the street shaking hands with the people of West Berlin. I've had a number of people here in this city speak to me about that incident. They couldn't all have been there, but they saw it on television and read about it in their newspapers, and I would say that President Johnson has a reservoir of affection here in the people of Berlin that is something quite valuable for him, and it was based mainly on that one trip. Of course, he's known Willy Brandt for years, but the main thing was that one trip after the wall.
John, thank you for that appraisal. Edwin, do you have anything else to add from Washington?
Not at this moment, Russ.
We'll be coming back to both of you later in the day. I might bring you right now this New York Times report from Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald, the alleged assassin of President Kennedy, made an informal plea today to communicate with an unidentified individual in New York City, this according to the New York Times. As he was being led handcuffed from a renewed police interrogation this morning, the 24-year-old warehouse worker paused in front of television cameras in a police department corridor and said, "I want to talk to Mr. and then there's a blank in New York City. The name he mentioned sounded something like Aft or Apt, but before he could be clarified, Oswald was pushed on by detectives.
Russ Ward.
Yes.
This is Newman in Washington. I saw that story, and the story I saw spelled the name of the lawyer, I take it was a lawyer, A-P-T. In fact, there is a well-known lawyer in New York who spells his name A-B-T, and who has been the attorney in many cases involving left-wing people. I don't want to go beyond that. My memory doesn't entirely hold up on this, but it is. I'm almost sure the man he had in mind spells his name A-B-T, and is an extremely well-known lawyer. Has been here in Washington in a number of cases, and I think that must be the man he had in mind. I believe his first name is John.
That's very interesting. It would seem to further indicate the allegiance that Lee Harvey Oswald had with communist causes.
The following is a note for stations. For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose. It's 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
John, are you still with us in Berlin? We now continue with our coverage of these events surrounding the death of President John F. Kennedy. We had been talking earlier with John Chancellor, NBC News in Berlin, and with Edwin Newman in the Washington newsroom. World leaders continue to announce plans to come to Washington Monday for the funeral of President Kennedy. Among them, General Charles de Gaulle of France, to fly to Washington tomorrow to attend the Monday funeral. The French president will be accompanied by Foreign Minister Maurice de Mouville, according to an Élysée Palace announcement today. De Gaulle's visit was said to express the profound grief with which his government views the assassination of the president. Although de Gaulle and Mr. Kennedy were at odds on many matters of policy concerning the Atlantic Alliance and the question of nuclear deterrent, it is clear that the French feel that the Western world has been dealt a severe blow by Mr. Kennedy's death. The French president will also wish to take the measure of the new president, Lyndon Johnson, according to sources from Paris. As vice president, Johnson visited France, but his encounters with President de Gaulle were quite brief. Sir Alec Douglas Hume is planning to fly to Washington tomorrow to attend the memorial service for the president and presumably to hold his first meeting with President Johnson. Sir Alec, Britain's new prime minister, will be accompanying Prince Philip, the Duke of Edinburgh. Buckingham Palace announced today that Queen Elizabeth's husband would represent the monarch at this memorial service. Sir Alec's decision to come to Washington is regarded as a mark of the esteem and affection with which the assassinated president was held in London. But it is also a reflection of the concern aroused by the replacement of the Western world's leader by a man virtually unknown to the British government and to the British people. The hope tonight is that Sir Alec will be able to establish quickly what the British have come to feel as the traditional, easy, personal relationship between the two countries' chiefs of government. That relationship is symbolized for many in London by the direct telephone link between number 10 Downing Street and 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. We again repeat the story we had earlier from Dallas, Texas, in that police this afternoon stated flatly that Lee Harvey Oswald, a pro-Castro Marxist and former U.S. Marine, the holder of a dishonorable discharge, that Lee Harvey Oswald assassinated President Kennedy, that they have evidence to prove it. They said Oswald had no accomplices in the act. As Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz put it, this case is cinched. We might add that Fritz is one of the most respected police officers in Texas. We might also add that Lee Harvey Oswald maintains he is innocent, that he did not assassinate President Kennedy. He also proclaims his innocence to the death of that Dallas, Texas policeman who was shot a short time after the president was assassinated. We repeat, Homicide Chief Captain Will Fritz says this case is cinched, but the prime suspect, Lee Harvey Oswald, says he is innocent.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
Wlw-Radio and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join with President Johnson in urging Americans to assemble in their respective churches to pay homage of love and reverence to Mr. Kennedy's memory.
Apparently we're not ready to feed back to the United Nations at this moment. I've just come back in, relieving Russ Ward. Outside here in New York, it's a grim gray day. It's raining hard in New York at the present time. We've talked to a few people around the city who seem to echo the sentiment of everyone still at this hour, more than 24 hours after the death of President Kennedy. No one can talk of anything else. The waitress in the restaurant, the elevator operator in the hotel, even the chambermaid who is making up the rooms talks about this fine young man and his great contribution to the United States. And while things are slowly returning to what appears to be normal on the streets here in New York at the United Nations headquarters, much is going on. And let us switch now to Pauline Frederick at the UN.
Jim, here at the United Nations, things have slowed down and will be pretty much at a standstill until after the funeral. I might tell you how all this brought reaction yesterday when the news first broke. Came at the lunch hour. The Secretary General was lunching outside the building with former President Eisenhower. Ambassador Adlai Stevenson and the President of the General Assembly, Ambassador Sosa Rodriguez of Venezuela, were lunching in one of the private dining rooms with some of the other delegates. President Sosa Rodriguez told me that Mr. Stevenson was called out and he didn't return. Then the word was passed that the president had been shot. A short time later, the ambassador called President Sosa Rodriguez, who's a very close friend, personal friend, and said, Carlos, he's dead. President Sosa Rodriguez said, I just didn't know what to say. I couldn't make any statement yesterday for television. It was all I could do to maintain my composure when the Assembly convened to make a brief statement of our grief. He also told me that when President Betancourt of Venezuela heard of the death of the president, he broke down and cried. The president had been very popular down there, and during his visit, of course, had been idolized by the people. And to think, he said, that President Betancourt had been through so many anxious moments about his own life, and then it was President Kennedy who had to be taken.
Pauline, you've known other moments of grief there at the UN. What do you think would compare with this in your experience in covering the UN in terms of reaction?
The other moment of grief, Jim, was the death of Dag Hammarskjöld, which stunned and shocked the UN. Now, yesterday, when the news was finally confirmed, the Assembly met very briefly. The President and the Secretary General made statements and then suggested that the members of the Assembly rise in a moment of silence. They did, and then the Assembly was recessed. Mr. Stevenson went back to his quarters across the street and eventually issued his moving statement which you probably have heard. The tragedy of this day is beyond instant comprehension. All of us who knew him will bear the grief of his death to the day of ours, and all men everywhere who love peace and justice and freedom will bow their heads. At such a moment, we can only turn to prayer. Prayer to comfort our grief, to sustain Mrs. Kennedy and his family, to strengthen President Johnson, and to guide us in time to come. May God help us. I think it was especially moving that just before that assembly convened for its moment of tribute, the American delegation came in and took their places, all of them red-eyed, and all the other delegates lined up in the aisle all the way down to the rostrum to come up and shake hands with every one of them. It was very touching. It was one of the most touching scenes I've ever seen here.
Pauline, after the ceremonies for President Kennedy, when will the United Nations resume its activity, and what will happen?
Monday, this place will be closed down entirely. Secretary General goes to Washington Monday morning. President Sosa Rodriguez has already left for Washington. Tuesday morning, there will be a memorial assembly at which all delegates who wish to speak will have the opportunity. And at that time also, Ambassador Stevenson will speak, in a sense responding to all the expressions of sympathy and grief and condolences that have been extended. And, you know, Jim, it's rather moving to be an American over here at this particular time, because foreign delegates, foreign reporters come up and take your hand and express their sympathy as though, each one of us had lost a member of the family.
In other words, all the foreign delegates, the foreign reporters, identify all Americans with our president.
That's right. That's right. And so, as a consequence, all business has been suspended out of tribute to the late president. The UN flag is flying at half-staff, and it flies at half-staff only with the death of a Secretary General or a head of state.
Well, the usual visitors to the UN in evidence over there today?
Yes, curiously enough, there are many visitors over here going through the halls, all very quiet, sort of subdued, but they indicate they are really the only sign of activity over here today.
The only expression we've had from Communist Cuba, direct expression, was the Cuban delegate to the UN yesterday. Is that correct?
He has just issued an official statement today.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
If you would like to hear that, I'll read it. It's dated November the 23rd. A quote, this is from Carlos Lechuga, the Cuban ambassador to the United Nations. In spite of the existing antagonisms between the United States government and the Cuban Revolution, we have heard with deep sorrow the news of the tragic death of President John F. Kennedy. All civilized men will always be saddened by events such as this. Our delegation to the Organization of the United Nations wishes to express that this is the sentiment of the people and the government of Cuba.
Well, thank you very much. I think that this is something that everyone is vitally interested in the reaction of countries that we know of only indirectly, really. We've got an interesting dispatch out of London that says the Soviet news agency TASS tonight accused American police of trying to implicate the Communist Party in the assassination of President Kennedy, and said the case against Lee H. Oswald is, in their words, suspicious. TASS made the comment in the dispatch in Russian, and a similar charge was made by the Home Service of Wlw-Radio. The more details are reported, said TASS, the darker and more suspicious the whole case is. The TASS dispatch made no specific denials, but said serious commentators are not putting faith in the police story about left-wing elements being responsible for this monstrous crime. They continue to await the results of further investigation. And the dispatch noted that Dallas police had told newsman Oswald admitted being a communist, if not an actual party member. It also took note, without commenting, of Oswald's 2 years in the Soviet Union, his Russian wife, and his connections with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. We've heard, however, reports from Dallas that are bringing out more and more evidence on the background of Oswald, his associations, and the case against him that is being developed by the prosecutor in Dallas at this time. There are some other stories in on our desk right now. An interesting sidebar on the situation from Mineola, New York, where 12 Americans in Mineola, Long Island, have not been told of the assassination of President Kennedy. They're members of a murder trial jury, now deciding the sentence for a young man they found guilty of a hold-up murder. Supreme Court Justice Edwin Lind shielded them from the news in fear that it might affect their deliberations. Cab drivers who took them to and from a motel were instructed not to mention the death, and waitresses who served them got similar instructions. Police made sure they talked to no one or heard no broadcasts at the motel. So what is probably the best-known story in the world at this moment is a story that is not known by these 12 Americans on a jury in Mineola, New York, weighing the fate of a man in a trial for murder. It's been reported before, I think it bears repeating now, that all public schools and offices of the New York City school system will be closed on Monday. A Board of Education announcement in Manhattan said that the public schools of New York City share the nation's great grief over the tragic death of President Kennedy. To make it possible for all pupils to be with their families for religious or other services on Monday, the schools and offices of the school system will be closed all day. And while that reflects the situation here in New York City, we've had information from other cities around the nation. The schools will be closed in a great many American communities on Monday during the full day, while funeral services for President John F. Kennedy are being held. To repeat an earlier story, a story from Dallas, quoting homicide Captain Will Fritz in Dallas, "This man killed the president," said Captain Fritz positively. He was referring, of course, to Lee Harvey Oswald, 24 years old, a man police say is openly proud of being a communist. Oswald is charged with murder in the assassination yesterday of President Kennedy. He has denied killing anyone. Officers continued questioning a second man described as a known subversive and a friend of Oswald, who was discharged as undesirable by the Marine Corps Reserve. Oswald himself, of course, was discharged under less than honorable conditions from the Marine Corps also. But Captain Fritz of the Dallas Police said, "We are convinced beyond any doubt that Oswald is our man." He added, "Without going into the evidence, I can tell you this case is a cinch. This man killed the president." He brushed aside all other questions. However, under the American system, Harry Oswald will be tried for murder. He will get a fair and just trial. Also, again repeating another story, quoting State Department authorities in Washington, they say they have no evidence indicating involvement of the Soviet Union or any other foreign power in the assassination of President Kennedy. Lee Harvey Oswald, a former Marine who spent 3 years in the Soviet Union, as we just said, has been charged with the shooting. When Oswald went to Russia, he announced his intention to renounce his American citizenship. He told the United States Embassy in Moscow he was a Marxist. After having made a change of mind and returning to the United States last year, Oswald reportedly became an active sympathizer of Prime Minister Fidel Castro's Cuba. State Department authorities said they also know of no evidence that Cuba was involved in Oswald action. And of course, we've just heard the TOSS report on that same situation, a view from the other side. Now for another view from Washington, let's switch to Edwin Newman in Washington.
There is more information available about plans for tomorrow, and here is that information from Bryson Rash at the White House.
The plans for tomorrow are fairly certain at this time. I checked with Pierre Salinger's office a short while ago. They told me they expected to be rather quiet in the morning, with nothing scheduled as between 8 a.m. and around 1 p.m. There will be a high requiem mass offered tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. for the repose of the soul of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. The mass will be celebrated at St. Matthew's Cathedral here in Washington. The sermon by the rector of the cathedral, the Monsignor John Cartwright. Shortly before 1 o'clock, the cortege will leave the White House, bearing the body of President Kennedy. It will leave from the North Portico in a horse-drawn caisson. This caisson will be preceded by a joint honor cordon of the armed services, and the route will be lined by a joint honor cordon. The first unit in in this line of march will be the Metropolitan Police Honor Guard. Following that will be the escort commander, the commanding general of the Military District of Washington. There will be muffled drums beating the funeral march as they go to Capitol Hill. Then will follow a company of U.S. Navy personnel, then the Special Guard of Honor, which will be the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Following the Joint Chiefs of Staff, there will be the National Color Detail. This is the review men carrying United States flags and also 2 guards. Following the color detail, the clergy will come immediately. Then, the caisson with 7 horses. Flanking the caisson will be 4 enlisted men from each of the 5 services, 10 on each side, 2 abreast, plus 4 special services personnel. This is a rather unusual number, the 7-horse caisson. There will be 6 horses drawing the caisson and a 7th horse led by a sergeant. After the caisson bearing the body of President Kennedy will come the personal flag detail with 1 man carrying the presidential flag. After that, there will be the body bearer detail, then the immediate family. Following the immediate family will be President Johnson, and at the end of this line of march will be the Metropolitan Police Honor Guard. This procession will proceed from the White House to the Capitol, where, after a 21-gun salute, ruffles and flourishes and the playing of Hail to the Chief, the casket will be carried into the Capitol and placed on the Lincoln catafalque in the center of the rotunda. The casket will be in state for public view beginning at 2 p.m. That is the information on tomorrow's funeral procession from the White House to Capitol Hill. And now Robert Goralski has additional information.
President Lyndon Johnson will read his proclamation, which had been issued earlier this afternoon by the White House. This is the proclamation designating Monday as a day of mourning, which the President asked all persons to join in by attending the church of his or her choice that day. This will be the second statement by Mr. Johnson since he assumed the presidency. The first was when he arrived at Andrews Air Force Base yesterday from Dallas, Texas. That was a very brief statement in which he indicated that the office was indeed a very heavy one to bear. And now he will be reading his proclamation, which had been issued earlier today. This will happen in about 20 minutes from now. Ed Newman, can you hear me? I think that's about all that I have and all that Bryson Rash has from the White House.
Yes, I hear you, Bob, and I hear Bryson. As you probably know, we have heard that arrangements are underway for burying President Kennedy in Arlington Cemetery just outside Washington. Ellie Abel of NBC News had reported that about an hour ago.
There's no confirmation of that here.
The Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, were at Arlington this morning looking over possible sites for the burial of Mr. Kennedy. There has been only one other president buried at Arlington, and that is William Howard Taft, who, of course, after he left the White House, became the Chief Justice, so that Mr. Kennedy would be the second American president to be buried in Arlington if the plans that we understand are in hand are held to.
Well, we'll certainly try to find out what we can on that, Ed. In the meantime, we are just experiencing the most tremendous downpour we've had all day today, one of the roughest we've seen in Washington in a long time. And this comes at a time when members of the Congress, the Supreme Court, and other dignitaries are still filing into the East Room of the White House from the North Portico. But the rain is about as bad as I've seen it in a long, long time.
Well, is that the rain that we hear striking your microphone? Are you standing in the rain?
This is one of the few times today that I'm out of the rain. I do have another microphone out there, which is getting drenched right now. I have a plastic cover on it, but I'm speaking from a microphone inside.
Bob, Bryson Rash said that there would be a horse-drawn caisson, 6 horses in front, 1 behind.
Of course, the empty one is for the fallen chief, the commander-in-chief.
And he said that that was an unusually large number of horses to draw a caisson in a funeral cortege. Does Bryson know why, then, it is, why they are using that many?
Bryson, I cannot hear you. Let me pose the question to him. Ed Newman wants to know why the number of horses involved is so large.
Well, there would be 6 horses normally carrying, pulling a caisson. 6 horses is normal for this kind of thing.
I see. I misunderstood you, Bryson. You perhaps said that there was an unusual number of escorts, servicemen, I believe. Did you say that?
No, I just said that the number 7 was unusual because you have the 6 horses putting the case on, and the 7th horse is the empty one, which is led by a sergeant.
I see.
Or an enlisted man. It's just an odd number of horses, 7.
Thank you, Bryson. Thank you, Bob. Back to you in New York, Jim Hurlbut.
Thank you, Edwin Newman. I think there's great interest across the nation in this man, Lee Harvey Oswald. I think it bears going into the whole background on his status in the case at the present time. Police have described Oswald as a man who is proud of his communist connections, a man discharged from the Marines as an undesirable. He has, however, denied killing anyone. The Defense Department announced in Washington this morning that Oswald once wrote to Connally from Russia, to Governor Connally of Texas, at that time the Secretary of the Navy, wrote to, at that time, Secretary Connally from Russia, pleading that his undesirable discharge be reversed. The exact date of the letter was not known, but presumably it was while Mr. Connally was serving as Kennedy's first Secretary of the Navy. And this raised a new question, whether the real target was Mr. Kennedy or Governor Connally. The two were riding with their wives in the presidential car when 3 shots ripped from this high-powered rifle on the 6th floor of the building overlooking the motorcade as it left downtown Dallas. But Chief of Police Jesse Curry has said, I think his actual target was the president. I say this because he hit the president twice from about a 75-yard distance on a slant, and apparently he was an expert marksman. 1 shot hit Mr. Kennedy in the head, 1 in the neck. Another slug tore through Mr. Connally's back, smashing ribs. He is reported now in satisfactory condition at Parkland Hospital in Dallas. Oswald sharply denied both shootings, says, I didn't kill the president, I didn't kill anybody. Oswald was arrested within an hour after the president died. Police dragged him screaming and struggling from a tiny movie theater in a shopping district in Dallas, where they'd gone in pursuit of a man who had gunned down a Dallas policeman only a few minutes earlier. District Attorney Henry Wade charged Oswald with murder in the deaths of both President Kennedy and policeman J.D. Tippit. Oswald returned about a year ago from a 3-year stay in Russia, where he married a Russian woman. 4 years ago, he swore allegiance to the Soviet Union and tried to renounce his United States citizenship. It was some time in this period that he wrote to Mr. Connally. The State Department later held he was still a citizen and could return to America. Oswald says he is now a member of the Fair Play for Cuba Committee. Curry said Oswald readily admitted he is a communist and apparently is proud of it. He said the second man questioned worked in the same place as Oswald, the Texas School Book Depository, a private firm which buys, stores, and distributes textbooks. The chief said FBI agents reported after Oswald's arrest that they had interviewed him a week or so ago, but he said he had not confirmed this. Officers said Oswald was definitely in the book warehouse when the president was shot. The assassination weapon was found, partly hidden behind books and amid scraps of fried chicken on the 6th floor. The Police Homicide Bureau said it was a 6.5-millimeter bolt-action rifle, apparently of Italian make. Curry told a reporter he believes Oswald carried the rifle to work with him yesterday morning and passed it off as window shades wrapped in heavy brown paper to the man who gave him a ride downtown. The first suspicion of this slim, black-haired man was by a policeman who saw Oswald in the building lunchroom. The officer actually pulled a gun on Oswald, but when the manager said Oswald worked there, he was allowed to go. A building porter said he took Oswald to the 6th floor in an elevator. When he got out, Oswald asked the porter to send the car back up for him. The porter then went to the ground floor to watch the presidential motorcade. After that, Chief Curry said, it is known that Oswald descended and left the building on foot. Then, within minutes, police broadcast a description of him. About 5 feet 9 inches tall, weighs about 160 pounds. He has black hair, sharp features, and a mouth that presses tightly together when he is angry and defiant. Somehow, Chief Curry doesn't know how, Oswald reached the Oak Cliff section across the Trinity River from downtown Dallas. The chief believes that Tippit, the slain police officer, spotted Oswald from his broadcast description and stopped him for questioning. Oswald fired a pistol. The officer dropped dead. A citizen, name unknown, later called for help on the policeman's prowl car radio. Then a suspicious character was reported in the Texas theater. 6 officers entered, found Oswald in a third-row seat. "This is it," Oswald said, springing from his seat. He grabbed his pistol, but it failed to fire. The officers dragged Oswald out in handcuffs. Oswald declined to take a lie detector test. He said paraffin tests made to determine from powder residue whether Oswald had fired a gun were positive. This meant Oswald had fired a weapon within a short time before he was arrested. Apparently it could have been either a rifle or a pistol or both. They wouldn't say. Oswald is now being held without bond, ordered so by Justice of the Peace David Johnston. In other news, tragedy in the news too, 63 persons are missing and presumed dead today in Norwalk, Ohio, in a fire that swept a path of devastation through a nursing home for the aged, infirm, and mentally ill. 24 other persons were rescued. The blaze destroyed the 10-year-old Golden Age nursing home near Fitchville, 15 miles southeast of Norwalk. The one-story concrete building burned quickly, fed by propane gas tank and tar roofing, and a brisk wind fanned the flames.
The following is a note for stations. For those local stations that might have some local news or public service announcements of local importance, we will provide stations with approximately 4 minutes for this purpose, at 5 minutes before the hour and half hour. The network will, however, continue coverage during this period. The following is the cutaway cue. You are listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
And now, let us switch back to Edwin Newman in Washington.
Here in Washington, Jim, we have just heard that the Queen of Greece, Queen Frederica, is arriving in New York tomorrow night to attend the funeral services for President Kennedy. She is to be accompanied by the Deputy Prime Minister and Foreign Minister of Greece, Sophocles Venizelos. That is another mark of respect from a foreign country that has been very close to the United States, certainly since exceptionally close since the days of the Truman Doctrine. Queen Frederica of Greece added to the list of those who are to attend the funeral services for President Kennedy on Monday. She arrives in New York tomorrow night. Jim, I was listening while you spoke of Lee Oswald, and also while you spoke of the story that Wlw-Radio and the Soviet news agency TASS are now putting out. It is very interesting that the Russians are now saying, quite officially, because it is being said on Wlw-Radio, that the assassination of the president was a political crime thoroughly prepared and planned. And they are also saying that it was not done by a left-wing man, such as Oswald evidently is. A commentator on Wlw-Radio named Valentin Zorin says, "Those who know how the security of President Kennedy is organized know that it is not possible for a fanatic to commit such an assassination." And then the Russians go on to say, "It is not accidental that it took place in the southern states, which are well known as a stronghold of racist and other fascist scum." And they say further that the president's murder was inspired by forces that were opposed to Mr. Kennedy's policy of improving relations with the Soviet Union. So the Russians have gone very, very far in holding to the position they took at once when the news came out that the president had been shot, that it was probably the work of fanatics on the right. And they are holding to that position in spite of the statements that are coming out of Dallas that the case against Lee Oswald, who himself had lived in Russia for several years, is cinched. I think in the circumstances that is rather a risky and strange thing for the Russians to be doing. And I wonder why they are doing it. I wonder whether Khrushchev, for example, who has sent messages to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy with no such suggestion as these in them, whether he knows and approves of what is being done. Do you have anything further on these Russian broadcasts, Jim?
No, actually we don't, Ed. That was the only information we had, and I wondered whether we're going to be able to get through, and I hope we can a little later on as this evening develops, and perhaps develop that phase of the story. Obviously, it means that we're going to have a further developing of this particular line of propaganda attack, and I think that your point in saying that Premier Khrushchev has sent those apparently genuinely sympathetic messages to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy indicates a personal feeling on his part, and also Mrs. Khrushchev sent messages too that may be somewhat in variance from the official position that is being indicated now on Moscow radio and in the Soviet news agency TASS. However, there is much more to be developed during the evening, and we'll be back with more of it in just a moment.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
Wlw-Radio in Cincinnati and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join with President Johnson in urging Americans to assemble in their respective churches to pay homage of love and reverence to Mr. Kennedy's memory.
About the reports from Soviet news agency TASS and from Moscow radio, we're talking about the official reaction of the Russian government, but now we're getting more and more word from other world headquarters around the world. It's beginning to sink in, obviously, that John Fitzgerald Kennedy is gone. Around the world, many wept, some fumed, others became apprehensive. Nations have their own precedents to mourn him. Cold War enemies praised him. People all over the earth, kings and presidents, street peddlers, fishermen, expressed their sorrow. In Britain, Queen Elizabeth II commanded her court to go into a week's mourning, and every minute from 11 o'clock in the morning until noon, the great tenor bell in Westminster Abbey tolled. This token of mourning is usually reserved only for dead British royalty. President Charles de Gaulle of France ordered the flag of France flown at half-staff immediately. By tradition, the tricolor flies at half-staff only on the day of the funeral of a chief of state. In Moscow, again, Premier Khrushchev broke off a tour to pay his personal respects at the U.S. Embassy and sent the messages we spoke about to President Johnson and to Mrs. Kennedy. But again, the story keeps developing in our nation's capital. Let's switch back now to Edwin Newman in Washington.
Earlier today, President Johnson proclaimed Monday a day of mourning, a national day of mourning. President Johnson intends to read that proclamation for the American people to see and hear, and he intends to do so in a very few moments. We switch now to Robert Goralski at the White House.
There's been a bit of a delay.
Well, we've lost Robert Goralski. We did hear him say there has been a slight delay, so we are safe and continuing, and as soon as we know that President Johnson is ready to read his proclamation, we will go back to the White House. We know in the meantime that there was a conference of Afro-Asian attorneys today in Conakry, which is the capital of Guinea in West Africa. The chairman asked those attending the meeting to stand for 1 minute in silent tribute to President Kennedy, and a delegation from Communist China walked out. After the tribute had been paid to Mr. Kennedy, the Chinese returned. The chairman of the meeting was the Attorney General of Guinea, Fodeba Keita, who is, by the way, a very well-known dancer and head of the dance company in Guinea. He described President Kennedy as an enemy of human slavery, and then he asked the delegates to stand. The delegations from 15 countries did stand, one of those countries being the Soviet Union. The delegation from China did not. We've just had a statement made by Prime Minister Nehru of India, who says we are deeply grieved and shocked both for personal and international reasons. The consequences of this are far-reaching and will gradually seep down. Now I believe that President Johnson is almost ready to read his proclamation of mourning. Here is Robert Goralski at the White House.
Actually, there's been a delay in President Johnson reading his proclamation. It had been scheduled for this very minute, but now we're told it won't be until 4:45 Central Standard Time, 10 minutes from now, before he actually reads the proclamation. The proclamation was actually issued by the White House press office earlier this afternoon. It proclaims Monday as a day of mourning throughout the nation, and President Johnson recommended the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of worship to, as he put it, to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God. Bryson Rasher is with me. Bryson, I believe you have something on the activities of former President Truman.
Well, it is interesting that President Johnson has an appointment with President Truman to see him at 4:45. Now, the delay in the message has been made until 4:45, which leads me to believe that it's possible that former President Harry S. Truman may accompany President Johnson for this particular moment in this historic first day, full day in the office of the presidency. I don't know. It's just possible, but the coincidence of the appointment time is interesting to me. It might also be possible as a show of unity that if Mr. Truman comes along, he might invite Mr. Eisenhower, and it would be a rather interesting thing if it works that way.
General Eisenhower has spent a great deal of time here today with President Johnson. They met in the Executive Office building for about 35 minutes in the Vice President's office. And then about 1 o'clock, General Eisenhower and President Johnson had lunch again in the Executive Office building. And now, as Bryson mentioned, Mr. Johnson was to have met with former President Truman at 4:45. He may well do that immediately after reading the proclamation, or as Bryson suggests, we may well have President Truman on hand at that moment, too. That's the story here from the White House.
Let's go back to New York now, and Jim Hurl. But, Jim, I understand you have Rome on the line.
Yes, we do, Edward. Coming up very shortly. You know, at Vatican City this morning, Pope Paul VI dedicated his morning mass to the dead president, the first Roman Catholic to become chief executive of the United States. And now for a direct report to Irving R. Levine in Rome.
Officials of the Italian state are conferring tonight to decide who to send to Washington to attend President Kennedy's funeral. An American diplomat told NBC News that the Italians were caught by surprise. They have been preoccupied trying to settle their own political crisis, which has been going on now for 18 days. Furthermore, Italian representatives who called on American Ambassador Frederick Reinhardt at the United States Embassy early today received the impression that high-level representation at the funeral was being discouraged. Thus, the news came as a surprise that Prince Philip, President de Gaulle, Chancellor Erhardt, Deputy Premier Mikoyan are among those going to the funeral. The Italians now would like to send someone of equal rank, but their government vacuum presents a problem. President Antonio Segni, who is suffering from a case of flu, which might prevent his traveling anyway, holds the only office not affected by the crisis. His absence might retard settlement of Italy's political troubles. So with the absence of Premier-to-be Aldo Moro, who today announced his agreement with 3 other political parties to try to form a coalition government. The most likely representative to the Kennedy funeral would seem to be Foreign Minister Attilio Piccione, but that still remains to be officially announced. This is Irving R. Levine, NBC News, Rome.
Irving, I know you've been busy in Rome ever since the story broke. Have you had time during these hours to check reaction in the Italian newspapers? What is the reaction in the press in Italy?
I think the reaction can best be expressed by some of the headlines. Besides the ordinary top headline of Kennedy assassinated, such headlines as these appeared. A crime which has moved and frightened the entire world was one headline. A tragic occurrence for humanity. Stupor, horror, and regret throughout the world for the loss of Kennedy, read another headline, that last one being in L'Unità, the Communist Party newspaper. Of course, there's a great deal of editorial comment, but one comment in particular struck me as significant, and that was one which expressed a certain disillusionment with the United States that this sort of thing could happen in a country which Europeans thought had achieved the highest type of political civilization.
There are always many Americans in Rome, even at this time of year. What has been the reaction of the American tourist in Rome?
The reaction was just what might be expected, one of deep grief. As if it were a magnet, the American embassy became the place to which tourists were drawn. Last night, the news, of course, broke here late in the evening. Many tourists were drawn to the embassy, simply stood in front of the embassy asking for confirmation. Today, at a very early hour, 2,000 tourists and other Americans, residents in Rome, had arrived at the embassy to sign the Book of Condolences.
Is the Rome Daily American published on Saturday, Irving?
Yes, it is, and its entire issue, both last night and tonight's edition, is devoted almost entirely to the Kennedy story.
What is the reaction to President Johnson?
One of curiosity, primarily. Of course, he visited Italy, but he wasn't taken seriously as far as his position was concerned. President Kennedy was considered the man, of course, who made American policy, and the Italian officials who met with President Johnson conducted talks with him more as courtesy rather than a discussion of policy. And consequently, there is a certain amount of not only curiosity, but a very tentative feeling of what kind of changes will this mean, if any, in American policy. You were asking a moment ago about the Daily American, and tonight's copy has just been handed to me. The headline is, "Communist Held as Killer, Kennedy Funeral Monday."
There are many communists in Rome. Have you seen any editorial expression from that arm of political activity?
No, the Communist Party reacted very much, as did all Italians. As I mentioned, the headline in the Italian Communist Party newspaper was one of shock. One of the most moving statements, actually, was issued by Palmiro Togliatti. I have a copy of it here. He is the chairman of the big Communist Party, the second largest party in Italy after the Catholic Party. And his statement, Togliatti, the Communist Party leader's statement, read as follows, read a bit of it. "We are bewildered by the tragic end of President Kennedy. The activity of this statesman had aroused in the peoples throughout the world great hopes and great expectations. It is absurd, almost impossible to think that these hopes could be truncated by a criminal act which arouses not only the condemnation but the anger of every civilized soul."
We were glad to have that statement repeated, Irving. We'd heard a part of it earlier in the day, and it does reflect a very sincere sort of reaction to the tragedy that has befallen the American people. Irving, I think now it is time for us over here to switch back to the nation's capital for the proclamation by President Johnson. And so let's switch to Edwin Newman in Washington.
Jim, we are 3 minutes from the time that Robert Goralski said President Johnson would be reading his proclamation of the National Day of Mourning, that day being next Monday. Let's see whether they are ready now at the White House. Bob Goralski, are you ready?
Yes, Ed. I think that the President will still read the proclamation at 4:45 Central Standard Time, just a few minutes from now.
You said Central Standard, Bob. You mean Eastern Standard?
I don't think that's the first mistake I've made today, Ed. Indeed, I meant Eastern Standard Time. The fish room where the President will read the proclamation is just jam-packed with newsmen, photographers, television cameras, radio microphones in there, and everybody is standing by now for the President to enter. It's oppressively hot in there. At the moment I am speaking from the press room, which is across the lobby from the fish room. The fish room, I might add, is called thus because of fish which are hung on the walls, items that President Kennedy had placed there after he became president in 1961. But we're still waiting. There's been no other information, we are still expecting President Johnson to read the proclamation. This was his first proclamation. It was issued by the White House press office earlier this afternoon. It was then followed by an executive order closing government departments and agencies on Monday, the day which has been proclaimed by President Johnson as a day of mourning. Ed, we still haven't been able to get any further word yet on funeral arrangements. Ellie Abel's report to the effect that the president will be buried at Arlington Cemetery will neither be confirmed nor denied by the White House press office.
May I just cut in, Bob, and you interrupt me, of course, as soon as you hear the president is coming. What Ellie Abel reported was that the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and the Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, had been to Arlington this morning to look at burial sites, and that this had led him and a good many other people who, when they heard about it, to conclude that that was where the burial would take place. Ellie Abel did not say so flatly. He knew only that Robert Kennedy and Robert McNamara had been to Arlington this morning. While we're waiting for President Johnson, I would just like to say that the Argentine delegation to the funeral services has now been announced. The Vice President of the Argentine Republic, Dr. Carlos H. Perrete, is coming for the service. He's to be accompanied by the Foreign Minister, Dr. Miguel Ángel Zavala Ortiz, and the Secretary of War, General Ignacio Avalos. So the Argentines are sending their Vice President, their Foreign Minister, and their Secretary of War, and they are to arrive tomorrow evening.
Well, Ed, between the two of us, perhaps we can recapitulate our knowledge as of the moment of the heads of foreign states who will be arriving here. Of course, General de Gaulle, the President of France, Prince Philip representing the Queen of Britain, the British Prime Minister, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, Queen Frederica of Greece, various other persons, Baudouin of Belgium.
Prince Baudouin of Belgium, Eamon de Valera, the 81-year-old President of Ireland, is coming. Ludwig Erhard, the Chancellor of West Germany, is coming.
Berlin's Mayor, Willy Brandt, will also be here.
It will be a tremendously dramatic event. In saying that, it is hardly necessary to say it will be a tremendously dramatic event that all of us would much prefer never to see. But it is bringing the great of the world to Washington almost in the way that the royalty of the world used to turn out when one of their number had died. If you look at some of the photographs that are available of the funeral of Edward VII in England early in this century, all the great and royal of the world turned out, and President Kennedy is receiving a great tribute from people and countries all over the world. We did not mention Anastas Mikoyan, the first Deputy Prime Minister of the Soviet Union.
Yes, I wanted to add, too, that at 5 o'clock, about 15 minutes from now, the Foreign Diplomatic Corps will start arriving at the North Portico, and they will view the casket bearing the body of the late president. On the proclamation, which we're expecting now any minute, this was the first one issued by President Johnson, and I don't imagine that he will issue another proclamation approaching this one in tenor and everything else. Ordinarily, presidents do not read proclamations. They are merely issued, and I suppose that the reason he is doing it is to impress upon the American nation by radio and television, because this will be available for all to see, the gravity and the scope of what President Kennedy's death has meant.
Bob, while we've been talking about the important people who are coming here, we perhaps overlook some of the less important people who nevertheless have shown what the passing of the president means to them. In a suburb of London called Sydenham, a children's rose garden was dedicated today to Mr. Kennedy. There are 130 roses in the garden, and 130 children will tend them in the president's memory.
If I heard correctly earlier, didn't John Chancellor report from Berlin that a famous square there where President Kennedy appeared earlier this year will also be renamed after President Kennedy?
Yes, and in Moscow, shortly after Prime Minister Khrushchev was there and left with the American ambassador, Floyd Kohler, a young Russian girl who had obviously been crying came into the American embassy with a great bouquet of white flowers, and she said, "I brought these because I liked your president." In Katanga province in the Congo, the entire provincial cabinet went to the residence of the United States consul, each man accompanied by his wife. And one of them explained, "This is an old Bantu custom. We Bantus always mourn the passing of a great chief." Katanga is, of course, has not in the past always been friendly, very receptive to American policy. So I think it is very striking that that should have happened there.
The average person in Washington is expressing his sentiments in the same way. Many people have passed by and presented bouquets to White House guards, and they asked that they present them to Mrs. Kennedy. Most of this, though, was last night and early this morning, before the White House announced that the Kennedy of the late president had requested that flowers not be sent, but instead that an equivalent amount of money be sent to charitable institutions.
Bob, do I hear behind you that the president is coming?
He is just walking across, yes. We are looking out the press room window now. He is coming across West Executive Avenue from the Executive Office Building. He is entering the White House from through the west door on the street level. The fish room is prepared now. The cameras are getting set, our microphones are in order, and we would imagine that it just will take him now a matter of a minute or even less before he comes up from West Executive Avenue, that entrance there, and then into the fish room. Hoping to see more now. He is in the White House now. Bryson Rash is standing next to me with a better view. We don't know anything more about the meeting with former President Truman as yet. We're assuming for the moment that it will be held immediately after the proclamation is read. Bryson?
I should assume so. It's impossible to identify anyone as they walk across the street. There's a great group of men coming across under umbrellas with raincoats on in this driving rain, and it's darkness settling over the city, and it's just impossible to identify anyone. Anyone could be with the president at the moment. But he's now in the White House, coming up in the elevator. He'll be in the fish room in a matter of moments.
The rain has not only made us awfully wet here, we're soaked through, but it's made identification extremely difficult, as Bryson has pointed out. At the North Portico, most of the persons there have their windows rolled up. The inside is steaming. And now we're here. The president is now entering the fish room of the White House. He is walking to the battery of microphones. Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
To the people of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, 35th President of the United States, has been taken from us by an act which outrages decent men everywhere. He upheld the faith of our fathers, which is freedom for all men. He broadened the frontiers of that faith, and he backed it with the energy and the courage which are the mark of the nation that he led. A man of wisdom, strength, and peace, he molded and moved the power of our nation in the service of a world of growing liberty and order. All who love freedom will mourn his death. As he did not shrink from his responsibilities, but welcomed them, so he would have us not shrink from carrying on his work beyond this hour of national tragedy. He said it himself. The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world. Now, therefore, I, Lyndon B. Johnson, President of the United States of America, do appoint Monday next, November 25, the day of the funeral service of President Kennedy, to be a national day of mourning throughout the United States. I earnestly recommend the people to assemble on that day in their respective places of divine worship, there to bow down in submission to the will of Almighty God, and to pay their homage of love and reverence to the memory of a great and good man. I invite the people of the world who share our grief to join us in this day of mourning and rededication, in witness whereof I have hereunto set my hand and caused the seal of the United States of America to be affixed, done at the city of Washington this, the 23rd day of November, in the year of our Lord 1963, and of the independence of the United States of America, the 188th.
That was the President of the United States, Lyndon B. Johnson, reading a proclamation issued earlier this afternoon, proclaiming Monday, November 25th, as a day of mourning for President Kennedy. As President Johnson read the proclamation, when he said, "We offer reverence to the memory of a great and good man," he was filled with emotion. We thought for a moment that he might break down and cry, or in some way show his emotions and manifest themselves in a more obvious way. Tears seemed to come to his eyes at that moment when he referred to a great and good man. He paused and looked straight ahead when he said it. He referred to the President as a man of wisdom, strength, and peace. That's it from the White House, Ed Newman.
We've just heard here in the NBC newsroom in Washington that President Johnson plans to address a joint session of Congress next week. That information comes from a top leader in the administration. He said it is still not certain whether Mr. Johnson will make his first congressional appearance as president on Wednesday or Friday, but it probably will be on Wednesday. He said he did not expect it to be a program speech or a partisan speech. That is to say, it will not deal with legislative matters. He thought the president would make a plea for national unity. Now back to Jim Hurlbut in New York.
And Ed Newman will have a report from Hyannisport in just a moment.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. You're listening to NBC's continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John Fitzgerald Kennedy.
And now for a report on the reaction of former Ambassador Joseph Kennedy to word that his son had been killed, we switch to Hyannisport and Jim Simpson.
Ambassador Joseph B. Kennedy, father of the late president, has taken the news of his son's untimely death remarkably well. That report we received just moments ago from the Kennedy compound in Hyannisport. In fact, said our source, he's a real gutsy guy, meaning the ambassador. The source was not being disrespectful at all, but was certainly full of admiration. Because of the great length of time in which we did not hear anything about his reaction to the news, there was concern that possibly the 75-year-old ambassador was not reacting as well as some might have hoped. He's an
Thank you, Jim. In Washington, Mrs. Kennedy and her 2 children, Caroline and John Jr., who now have been told of their father's death, have attended a private mass in the White House. 75 friends and relatives also were present. News Secretary Pierre Salinger says the children, Caroline and John Jr., were told last night. He did not say who told them of the tragic death of their father.
The NBC radio network has canceled all regularly scheduled programs to bring you this continuous coverage of the events surrounding the death of the late President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. We will be on the air with this continuous coverage until 11 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight. We will begin our continuous coverage on Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time and on Monday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We now pause for station identification.
Wlw-Radio, Cincinnati, and the Crosley Broadcasting Corporation join our listeners in an expression of deep sorrow on the death of our president.